Welcome to Princess Diana, the iconography of modern royalty. There is a particular quality to the light in Norfolk in the summer months. It falls soft and wide across the flatlands, catching the edges of wheat fields, spilling through the long windows of country houses, settling over everything with a kind of golden patience. It was into this light, into this landscape, that a girl was born who would one day become the most photographed woman on earth. This is the story of a self moving into its own full possession, the slow, costly, and irreversible process of becoming a woman who looked directly at what the world looked away from. This standard-length biography explores the extraordinary life, complex interior world, and enduring global legacy of Diana Spencer. From the quiet country estates of her youth to the relentless glare of the international media, we trace her journey from a shy aristocratic schoolgirl to a radical public figure who chose to break the mold of tradition to become a queen in people's hearts. The Child of Sandringham, 1961 to 1977. There is a particular quality to the light in Norfolk in the summer months. It falls soft and wide across the flatlands, catching the edges of wheat fields, spilling through the long windows of country houses, settling over everything with a kind of golden patience. It is a light that seems to belong to another century, unhurried, aristocratic, indifferent to the noise of the modern world. And it was into this light, into this landscape, that a girl was born who would one day become the most photographed woman on earth. The date was the 1st of July, 1961. The place was Park House, a 10-bedroom estate sitting on the edge of the Sandringham Royal Estate in Norfolk, England. A house leased from the Crown, a detail that would later carry a kind of quiet irony. Her parents were Edward John Spencer, Viscount Althorpe, and his wife the former Frances Ruth Roche. They already had two daughters, Sarah, born in 1955, and Jane, born in 1957. They had also had a son, John, who had been born prematurely in 1960 and had lived for only 10 hours. That loss cast a long shadow. The pressure on Frances to produce a male heir was immense, the kind of pressure that is rarely spoken aloud in aristocratic families, but is felt in every room, at every meal, in every silence. And so when Diana Frances Spencer arrived on that 1st of July, the atmosphere, though not cold, was tinged with a complicated disappointment. She was not the son they had been hoping for. She was a girl, healthy and fair, with blue eyes and a quality of stillness about her even in those first hours that those who attended the birth would later struggle to describe. She was simply present. Fully, quietly present. She was not given a middle name that honored a queen or a duchess. She was named Diana after a Spencer ancestor and Frances after her mother. The christening was held at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham, the same church used by the royal family for their own private worship. Even the geography of her earliest days placed her in orbit around the Crown, though she could not have known it. None of them could. Park House itself was a generous, rambling home, not palatial but grand enough to employ a small staff, to have nurseries on an upper floor and formal rooms below, to keep the children at a comfortable distance from adult life. Diana's earliest world was contained within its walls and the gardens that surrounded them. There were wide lawns where she learned to walk, hedgerows thick with birds, and the distant sound of the estate beyond, the occasional movement of horses, the far-off calling of gamekeepers across the fields. She was, by all early accounts, a cheerful and affectionate child, though one marked by a particular sensitivity that set her apart from her siblings. She felt things deeply, this was clear from the beginning. When animals were hurt, she wept. When other children were unhappy, she noticed. Her younger brother Charles, born in 1964, 3 years after Diana, and the longed-for male heir who finally arrived, would later describe her as always the one who wanted to make things better, who couldn't walk past something suffering without stopping. Charles's birth did, in some ways, relieve the pressure on the family. There was now an heir. The title would pass on. But the arrival of a son into a household that had been quietly strained did not repair what was already beginning to break beneath the surface of the Spencers' marriage. Johnny Spencer, Diana's father, was a man shaped by duty and tradition, a product of Eton and the Coldstream Guards, accustomed to the rhythms of the English countryside and the social rituals of the landed gentry. He was not a cruel man. But he was a man of his era, one who found emotional expression difficult, who kept his interior life behind the carefully maintained facade of the English gentleman. He expected order. He expected continuity. He expected his wife to inhabit a world that was, increasingly, not the world she wished to inhabit. Frances Spencer was different. She was younger than her husband, considerably so, and possessed of a vitality and a hunger for life that the quiet corridors of Park House could not fully contain. She had married Johnny when she was only 18 years old, and by her mid-30s, she was a woman who had lived long enough inside a life chosen for her to know that she needed something else. Whether her dissatisfaction was primarily with her marriage or with the constrictions of the life it entailed is a question that historians and biographers have debated endlessly. What is not debated is the consequence. In 1967, Frances Spencer met Peter Shand Kidd, a wallpaper heir with whom she fell deeply in love. Diana was 6 years old. Charles was 3. Sarah and Jane were already away at school. The house, which had never been entirely warm, grew colder. The parents who had occupied its rooms began to occupy separate futures. There were arguments, not the operatic kind but the quieter, more devastating variety, conducted in lowered voices behind closed doors, ending in silences that lasted for days. Diana absorbed all of it. Children of that age have a particular antenna for marital unhappiness. They cannot always name what they are sensing, but they sense it with absolute precision. She would later describe a feeling during that period of always waiting for something, though she could not have said what. A feeling of doors that might open or close without warning. In the autumn of 1967, Frances Spencer left. She packed her belongings and departed Park House, leaving the children behind. This was not, in the context of the time, as straightforward a decision as it might appear. The laws governing divorce and custody in Britain in the 1960s were not designed with mothers in mind. A woman who left the marital home, who was seen to have abandoned her children, was legally and socially vulnerable. Frances would later fight for custody of her children, and she would lose. The case was high-profile enough, and the power of the Spencer family sufficiently considerable, that the court sided with Johnny. For Diana, the departure of her mother was not a single moment, but an accumulation of absences. The school runs that stopped. The bedtime rituals that changed. The particular quality of a house that has lost the person who animated it. She missed her mother with an intensity that she would carry for years, a grief complicated by the fact that she could not fully articulate it, that no one around her seemed entirely equipped to help her carry it. The nannies came and went through Park House during these years, a rotating cast of women who were hired and dismissed with a regularity that itself spoke to the household's disorder. Some of them Diana liked. Some she did not. One, a woman named Janet Thompson, was remembered by the Spencer children as particularly kind. Another was, by various accounts, less so. Diana herself would later describe a period of weeping quietly at night, pressing her face into the pillow so as not to be heard, her heart full of something she had no name for. She was 7 years old. She kept guinea pigs and a cat named Marmalade. She swam in the heated outdoor pool at Park House in the summer months. She collected things, shells, buttons, small objects that caught her eye. She was, to those who saw her at a distance, simply a fair-haired girl growing up in a large house in Norfolk. But there was a quality to her interiority that those who knew her would later recognize as the foundation of the woman she would become. An awareness of other people's pain that seemed, even at this age, to exceed what was ordinary. The divorce of Frances and Johnny Spencer was finalized in 1969. It caused a scandal of considerable proportions within aristocratic circles, not least because Frances's own mother, Ruth Roche, Lady Fairmoy, a woman of the bedchamber to Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, sided publicly with Johnny Spencer rather than with her own daughter. This was a betrayal of the most intimate kind, and it fractured the relationship between Frances and her mother for many years. It also, though no one remarked upon it at the time, planted in Diana an early and lasting lesson about the relationship between loyalty and institution, about the ways in which the established order demands allegiance even at the cost of the personal. Frances married Peter Shand Kidd later that year. The children visited her during school holidays, traveling to the flat in London she shared with her new husband, later to the farm on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. These visits were a kind of double life, the world of Park House and the world of Frances, existing in parallel, neither quite belonging to the other. At Park House, Johnny Spencer attempted to maintain the domestic routines as best he could. He was not naturally gifted at the work of raising children alone, but he was trying, in the way that men of his background and generation tried at things that fell outside the boundaries of their training. He hired staff. He maintained the household. He was present in the house, even when he was not quite present to the children within it. Diana's primary schooling had begun at Silfield School in King's Lynn, a private school to which she was driven each morning through the flat Norfolk roads. She was a child who could not yet be described as academically exceptional. Her gifts lay elsewhere, in her empathy, in her social instincts, in the particular quality of attention she brought to the people around her, but she was engaged, curious, and eager to please. She wanted people to like her. She wanted, in the quiet but powerful way of children who have experienced loss, to be loved. She was not shy exactly, but she was watchful. She noticed who was left out at break time. She sat beside children who were eating alone. She had a quality that adults in her life would later remark upon but struggle to explain. A way of making whoever she was speaking to feel as though they were, in that moment, the most important person in the room. It is tempting to trace this quality back to its origins in the nurseries of Park House, to the early experience of a household becoming unmoored, to the discovery that attention, truly given, unconditional, ungrudging, was among the rarest and most valuable things one person could offer another. In 1970, at the age of 9, Diana moved to Riddlesworth Hall, a boarding school in Norfolk. It was not far from Park House in geographical terms, barely 40 miles, but in emotional terms it represented an entirely different universe. Boarding school in England in the early 1970s operated according to rules and rhythms that had changed very little since the Victorian era. Children were expected to be resilient, to manage their homesickness quietly, to submit their individual natures to the larger collective identity of the institution. Diana was homesick. This was not remarkable. Most children sent away to school at that age are homesick, at least initially, but the texture of her homesickness was particular. She was not homesick for a place exactly. She was homesick for a feeling, for the sensation of being at the center of someone's attention, of mattering completely to someone in the way that very young children matter to their parents when everything is functioning as it should. She had experienced that feeling intermittently, in flashes, between the complications of her parents' disintegrating marriage. She missed it the way you miss something you never fully possessed. She found at Riddlesworth that she was good at certain things. She was an excellent swimmer. She had grown up with that pool at Park House, and her stroke was clean and confident. She was good with animals, particularly the guinea pigs that were permitted as pets in the school's small animal unit. She was elected tuck box monitor, a modest but significant honor within the social ecology of a girls' boarding school. She won the Legat Cup for helpfulness. This last award tells you something essential about Diana Spencer at 9 years old. Of all the distinctions that might be conferred upon a child, she won the one awarded for helping. The years at Riddlesworth passed with the peculiar slow sameness of boarding school life, terms that seemed endless during the winter months, holidays that were never quite long enough, the gradual construction of a self within an institution designed to smooth away individualism. Diana was not among the most academically accomplished of her peers. She struggled particularly with reading in her early years. There has been subsequent speculation, never fully confirmed, that she may have experienced some degree of dyslexia. But she was liked. She was genuinely, warmly liked, and for a child whose inner world was considerably more turbulent than her social surface suggested, this was not a small thing. In 1973, the world of the Spencer children shifted again. Their father, Johnny Spencer, became engaged to Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, the daughter of the novelist Barbara Cartland. Rain, vivacious, fashionable, and possessed of a personality that filled whatever room she entered, was not a welcome addition to the Spencer children's lives. They christened her, with the dark wit of children who have been given little formal control over the adults moving through their world, Acid Rain. The nickname tells you everything about the relationship. She was perceived as an interloper, a woman who had entered their father's life and rearranged the furniture of their childhood without asking permission. Diana particularly struggled with Rain. She was 12 when the relationship became serious, a difficult age under any circumstances, and the introduction of a powerful, glamorous stepmother into what had already been a fractured household introduced new turbulence into waters that had never quite settled. She was not, she would later say, unhappy at school. But she was not entirely happy at home. And the distinction between those two places, the institutional and the domestic, was becoming for her increasingly fraught. In 1975, everything changed again. Earl Spencer, Diana's grandfather, died, and Johnny Spencer inherited the earldom. Diana, overnight, became Lady Diana Spencer. The family moved from Park House to Althorpe, the ancestral Spencer estate in Northamptonshire, a house of an entirely different order of magnitude from anything she had known before. Althorpe was one of the great houses of England, an estate of some 14,000 acres, its principal house containing a collection of old masters, its rooms furnished across centuries of accumulated aristocratic taste. For Diana, the move was dislocating in ways that had nothing to do with aesthetics or grandeur. Park House had been, for all its complications, home, the place where her earliest memories lived, where she had learned to swim, where she had kept her guinea pigs, where she had lain awake at night listening to the Norfolk silence. Althorpe was grand and beautiful, and entirely impersonal. It was a house that had been inhabited by her family for generations, and that felt, paradoxically, like nobody's home at all. She enrolled at Westheath Girls' School in Sevenoaks, Kent in 1973, and it was here that she spent the formative years of her adolescence. Westheath was, by the standards of the English private school system, somewhat unconventional. Its emphasis was less on academic achievement and more on the development of the whole person, including, unusually for the era, on social responsibility. Girls at Westheath were taken to visit elderly residents at local care homes. They were encouraged to develop practical skills, alongside academic ones. This environment suited Diana with a precision that seems, in retrospect, almost too perfect. She flourished in the school's extracurricular life. She danced. She had loved dancing since early childhood, had taken lessons for years, and at Westheath her dancing became something more than a pastime. It became perhaps the first thing she was truly and deeply passionate about, the activity through which she could express what she could not say in words. She was talented, genuinely, measurably talented, and for a girl who had not found her gifts in the academic classroom, the dance studio was a revelation. She dreamed, in these years, of becoming a professional dancer. The dream was large and warm and entirely plausible to her, and no one who watched her move had any particular reason to tell her otherwise. She was less successful in her formal examinations. Her O-levels came and went without notable distinction. She failed them twice, a fact recorded in her official biography without particular ceremony, but one that clearly weighed on her at the time. The English school system of that era was not designed to accommodate intelligence that presented itself in forms other than the academic. And Diana's gifts, her empathy, her social fluency, her instinctive understanding of other people, were not the kinds of gifts that sat down neatly in an examination hall. But she was, at Westheath, regarded with genuine affection. Her housemistress, Muriel Stevens, noted that she had a gift for making people feel valued. The school's cook, to whom Diana would sometimes slip down to the kitchen to speak, remembered her as a girl who always asked how you were and actually waited for the answer. She won again no prizes for academic achievement. But she was again described by those around her in terms that all converged on the same quality: her care for other people, her readiness to notice what others overlooked, her refusal to walk past unhappiness without acknowledging it. The years at Westheath were also years of growing physical self-consciousness. Diana was becoming, through her mid-adolescence, an uncommonly striking young woman, tall, fair, with those blue eyes that seemed to absorb rather than merely reflect the light around them. She was not, by her own account, confident in her appearance. She stood at 5 feet 10 inches by the time she was a teenager, and was acutely self-conscious about her height, her tendency to slouch in photographs, the gap between the way she looked and the way she felt inside. The two rarely matched for Diana in these years. She presented to the world a serenity she did not entirely feel. She was also, during this period, navigating the complex emotional landscape of a young woman who had grown up watching one marriage dissolve and seeing a new one constructed in its place, her father's marriage to Rain, formalized in 1976, which proceeded with the minimum of ceremony and the maximum of disruption to the Spencer children. She had a mother she loved but saw intermittently, a father she loved but could not always reach, a stepmother she resented but could not avoid, a brother she adored, and sisters who were moving into their own adult lives. The family was not so much broken as reconfigured, rebuilt around new centers of gravity that Diana had not chosen and did not always accept. She left West Heath in 1977 at the age of 16, without the qualifications that might have opened conventional paths forward. A brief and unhappy period at the Institut Alpen Wiedemannet, a finishing school in Rougemont, Switzerland, followed. It was not a success. She spoke no French, found the curriculum bewildering, and was profoundly homesick. She returned after a single term, the Swiss interlude filed away, as one of those experiments that occasionally must be undertaken in order to confirm what one already knows, that she was not a girl who would find herself in institutions of that kind. She was 16 years old. She was living between houses, Althorpe, her mother's place in London, the flats and rooms that constituted the mobile geography of an aristocratic childhood. She had no clear direction, no academic credentials to speak of, no particular plan. She wanted to dance, but had been told, gently, definitively, that at her height a professional ballet career was not realistic. She was fond of children and imagined in a vague and unformed way that she might do something with that fondness, teach perhaps or care for young people in some capacity. What she had in the winter of 1977 was herself, a 16-year-old girl carrying the complex freight of her childhood, the early loss of maternal security, the resilience that loss had required, the sensitivity that it had deepened, the social gifts that had been quietly, steadily refined through years of watching and feeling and noticing what others missed. She had a quality that the circumstances of her life had not created, but had certainly sharpened. A capacity for empathy so acute that it would later make her simultaneously the most loved and the most vulnerable public figure of her generation. And there was one more thing that happened in 1977, something small, unremarked upon at the time, passing without ceremony or premonition. Diana Spencer, 16 years old, went to a shooting party at Althorpe. She was there because her sister Sarah was there, and Sarah was there because she had recently been introduced to a young man who had come to shoot pheasant on the Spencer estate. The young man was tall and fair-haired, with ears that were slightly prominent, and a manner that was simultaneously formal and uncertain. His name was Prince Charles. He barely noticed Diana. She was to him simply her sister's younger sibling, a schoolgirl, a child almost, one of the numberless figures who populated the background of any large country house gathering. He spoke to Sarah. He ate at the table. He departed. Diana watched him go and thought by her own later account that he was, and these were her words, rather fun and pretty amazing. She did not yet know what she was watching. She did not yet know what any of it meant, the great house, the shooting party, the tall young man with the uncertain eyes. She was 16, and the future was a country she had not yet entered, a place that lay somewhere beyond the flat Norfolk light of her childhood, beyond the corridors of West Heath, beyond the complicated silences of Park House. She could not have known, no one could have known, that the small, unremarkable meeting at a country house in Northamptonshire in the autumn of 1977 was the first thread of a story that would not end quietly or privately or on its own terms. The child of Sandringham was stepping, one careful foot at a time, into history. The Courtship in Clarence House, 1977 to 1981. There is a particular kind of waiting that belongs to the years between adolescence and adulthood, a suspended, searching quality, as though life has paused on an intake of breath, holding itself in readiness for something whose shape has not yet become clear. For Diana Spencer, the years between 1977 and 1981 had exactly this quality. She was a girl becoming a woman, moving through London's quiet streets and modest flats, working, laughing, keeping her own counsel, not yet knowing that the world was already, in ways entirely invisible to her, arranging itself around her future. She was 17 when she left school, and arrived in London with the particular mixture of freedom and formlessness that characterizes that transitional moment in a young woman's life. She had no degree, no professional qualification, no clearly defined vocation. What she had was energy, goodwill, and the deep instinctive pull toward other people that had defined her since childhood. London received her as it receives all young women of her background and generation, with a kind of benign indifference, opening its grey streets and Georgian squares to her without ceremony or welcome, leaving her to make of it what she could. She moved initially into a flat in Coleherne Court, in the Earl's Court area of West London. A flat that her parents helped to purchase, one of the practical gestures of support that aristocratic families of that era provided in lieu of the more demonstrative forms of parental engagement. It was a 3-bedroom flat, and Diana filled it over time with a succession of flatmates, young women of similar background, similarly navigating the early years of independent adult life. Carolyn Pride, Virginia Pittman, Anne Bolton. The names are recorded in the footnotes of her biography, but they deserve more than footnotes, because they constituted, during these years, something that Diana had not always reliably possessed: a community. A domestic world of her own making, governed by her own preferences, animated by her own particular warmth. The flat was not grand. It was the flat of young women of modest independent means, comfortable, cluttered in the friendly way of shared spaces, furnished with the kind of cheerful practicality that has nothing to do with taste and everything to do with living. Diana cleaned it herself. She cooked simple things, the kind of food that can be assembled in a small kitchen for a handful of people without ceremony. She was, by the accounts of her flatmates, a generous and companionable person to live with, attentive to the moods of those around her, the one who noticed when someone had had a bad day, and appeared at the door of their room with a cup of tea and the offer of conversation. She was working, during these years, in a series of positions that would have seemed to any external observer entirely unremarkable, the kind of work that young women of her class and background often took on in the years before marriage or career established itself. She worked briefly as a dance teacher, giving lessons to children at a dance studio in Knightsbridge, a role that brought her satisfaction but was always, given the circumstances of her own abandoned dancing ambitions, threaded with a private wistfulness. She worked as a cleaner for her sister Sarah's flat. She worked with particular happiness, as a helper and later as a fully employed assistant at the Young England Kindergarten in St. George's Square, Pimlico. It is worth pausing on the kindergarten, because it is here, in those small bright rooms full of paint and paper and the particular joyful chaos of very young children, that something essential about Diana Spencer becomes visible. She had not trained as a teacher. She had no formal qualifications in early childhood education. What she had was something that no qualification can confer: a genuine, unperformed delight in the company of small children, a natural authority that came not from discipline but from warmth, an ability to descend entirely to a child's level without condescension or effort. The children loved her. Parents remarked upon her. Her employers noticed, with the quiet satisfaction of people who have hired well, that she had a gift. She arrived each morning at the kindergarten with the same quality of presence that she brought to every room she inhabited. Fully there, fully attentive, her attention not parceled out or rationed but given freely. She sat on the floor with the children. She painted with them. She read to them with the kind of absorption that makes stories feel genuinely dangerous and thrilling, the voice dropping at the frightening parts and lifting at the joyful ones. She was 20 years old, working in a Pimlico nursery for wages that amounted to a very modest income, and she was, by all available evidence, entirely content. Content, but not without her private complications. The years at Coleherne Court were not unclouded. She was navigating the continuing complexity of her family dynamics. The relationship with her stepmother Rain remained difficult. The relationship between her parents remained formally cordial and emotionally remote, and the question of her own future was one that she could not yet answer with any certainty. She dated in this period, with the tentative caution of a young woman who has grown up watching the damage that intimacy can do when it fails. There was no one serious. There was no one who made the future feel suddenly solid and shaped. There was simply the present, the flat in Earl's Court, the children in Pimlico, the flatmates and their cups of tea, and the wide patient availability of London on an ordinary afternoon. It was in this ordinary, unremarkable life that the extraordinary arrived, slowly, obliquely, not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of something that has already been decided by forces operating above and beyond the ordinary. The first thread, as we have seen, had been laid in 1977 at the shooting party at Althorpe. But threads require time to draw together, and the drawing together of Diana Spencer and Prince Charles took longer than the romanticized versions of the story tend to acknowledge. The intervening years were not a period of ardent pursuit. Charles was, in these years, involved with other women, a fact that was widely known and widely discussed within the overlapping social circles in which both he and Diana moved. His name was linked, most significantly, with Camilla Shand, who had by this time become Camilla Parker Bowles, married to the cavalry officer Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. The relationship between Charles and Camilla was a subject of considerable speculation within court circles, a complexity that existed in the background of everything that was about to happen, though Diana herself would not fully understand its dimensions until considerably later. Charles, in the late 1970s, was a man under a particular and peculiar kind of pressure. He was 30 years old in 1978, and the question of whom he would marry had long since ceased to be merely a personal one. It was a constitutional matter. It was a question that exercised his family, his advisors, the press, and a significant portion of the British public with an intensity that most men of that age, most men of any age, are fortunate enough to never experience. He was the heir to the throne of one of the oldest monarchies in the world, and the woman he chose to marry would become, in time, the Queen of England. The requirements for that woman, as they were understood in the late 1970s, were considerable and largely unspoken. She needed to be aristocratic enough to be accepted by the establishment. She needed to be young enough, this was stated with a directness that would today be received very differently, to be considered reliably virginal, since the heir to the throne could not be seen to be marrying a woman with a romantic history. She needed to be English. She needed to be, in the terminology of the time, suitable. It was a list that sounds, in its entirety, less like the description of a future partner, and more like the specification for a position of employment, which is, in certain uncomfortable ways, precisely what it was. Into this calculation came Diana Spencer, not abruptly, not dramatically, but through the natural mechanisms of a social world in which everyone of a certain background eventually knows everyone else. Her sister Sarah had, as mentioned, been briefly involved with Charles. That relationship had come to nothing, partly, it was said, because Sarah had spoken too openly to the press about the nature of their connection, a cardinal error in the world she was navigating. But the Spencer family remained within Charles's orbit, and Diana, growing older and more noticeable with each passing year, remained within his field of vision. They encountered each other again in the summer of 1980, at a house party in Sussex, a weekend gathering at the home of a mutual friend, Philippa Dodd, held at a property called Petworth. Diana was sitting in a field watching Charles play polo, that quintessentially aristocratic sport, with its combination of athleticism and social ritual, which formed a central part of his leisure life. She found herself next to him afterward, in the informal gathering that followed the game, and they talked. What they talked about is not perfectly recorded. What is recorded, because Diana herself described it later with characteristic directness, is what she felt. She felt, she said, sorry for him. He had recently attended the funeral of Lord Mountbatten, his beloved great-uncle and mentor, who had been murdered by an IRA bomb in August of 1979. Charles had been visibly devastated by the loss. Mountbatten had been, in many ways, the most significant paternal figure in his life, the person who had spoken to him with a directness and warmth that the formal constraints of the royal family made difficult from within. Watching Charles at the funeral, and sitting beside him in that Sussex field, Diana felt the grief in him, and responded to it in the way she always responded to grief in other people, with her full, undivided, compassionate attention. She told him that he had looked so sad at the funeral, that he was carrying something very heavy. She said it simply, directly, without the social hedging that most people in her position would have employed. And Charles, who was not accustomed to being spoken to, with that quality of unguarded directness, felt something shift. He began to call her. The calls were tentative at first, invitations to events, to polo matches, to dinners. She accepted. She navigated these early encounters with a naturalness that those who observed them found striking. She was not overwhelmed by who he was. She was not performing for him, or deploying the kind of calculated charm that the more strategically minded young women in his social circle might have brought to the situation. She was simply herself, warm, direct, attentive, occasionally funny in the self-deprecating way that had always been her social register. She made him laugh. This was not a small thing. Charles was a man who did not laugh easily in company, for whom the formality of royal life had erected certain barriers, and Diana's ability to dismantle those barriers effortlessly was both disarming and, for him, deeply appealing. Through the late summer and autumn of 1980, the relationship developed with a speed that the romantic version of the story presents as evidence of mutual passion, and the more sober historical version tends to read somewhat differently. Charles was, by this point, under genuine pressure from his family and advisors to make a decision. The press had begun to notice Diana, had begun in fact to pursue her with an aggression that would prove to be an augury of everything that was to come, though no one, least of all Diana, fully understood it yet. She was followed. Photographed. The photographers stationed themselves outside her flat in Coleherne Court, outside the kindergarten in Pimlico, outside the houses of friends and family. They had identified her as a possibility, as the candidate, the chosen one, the woman who would answer the question that had occupied so much column space for so long. They were not wrong. But the process of their identification, and the methods they employed to pursue it, gave Diana her first experience of what it meant to exist in public life, not a gentle or preparatory experience, but one of sudden, aggressive visibility, a light turned on without warning in a room you thought was private. She handled it with a composure that astonished seasoned royal observers. She said nothing. She smiled, that particular Diana smile, wide and slightly downcast. The eyes dropped before being raised to meet the camera with an expression that managed to be simultaneously vulnerable and contained. She gave them the photographs they wanted, without giving them anything of herself. It was an instinctive rather than a trained performance, and it was, from the very beginning, extraordinarily effective. Meanwhile, at Balmoral, the royal estate in the Scottish Highlands where the family gathered each summer, Diana was invited to spend time with Charles and the royal family in the autumn of 1980. This was a significant development. An invitation to Balmoral was not a casual social gesture. It was a vetting, though it was not described as such. It was the family looking collectively at the woman who might join them, assessing her suitability, not with the tools of modern psychology or emotional intelligence, but with the ancient instinctive mechanisms of a dynasty that had been conducting exactly this kind of assessment for centuries. Diana passed. She walked the estates in Wellington boots, and didn't complain about the cold. She sat through dinners, at which the conversation was conducted in the particular code of people who have known one another forever, and require no explanation of their references. She was polite to the Queen. She was warm to Prince Philip. She was respectful and unobtrusive, and entirely without the social nerves that might have been expected of a young woman of 19, placed under such scrutiny. What was actually happening beneath that composed surface is something only Diana could have reported, and her later descriptions of those weeks at Balmoral suggest a young woman who was working very hard to appear comfortable in a situation that was in fact profoundly exposing. She loved him. This is the part that the complicated historical analysis of their relationship sometimes obscures, but it is the part that must be said plainly, because it was true. She loved him, with the particular intensity of a young woman who had not yet been disillusioned by love, who carried within her the accumulated longing of a childhood spent in a house from which love had gradually withdrawn, who had found in this complicated, melancholy, occasionally charming man, someone whose sadness she recognized and whose attention she treasured. Her love was not blind, she was too watchful, too perceptive for that, but it was full. It was real. It was the love of a person whose capacity for love was among the most remarkable things about her. What Charles felt is harder to determine. He was a man of deep complexity, intellectually restless, emotionally constrained, formed by a childhood that had given him privilege without intimacy, position without the ordinary reassurances of parental warmth. He found Diana appealing. He found her refreshing. He found in her directness and her laughter something that answered a need in him that the women of his own social and intellectual circle did not quite reach. Whether what he felt constituted love in the full sense, whether it was sufficient for the enormity of what was being proposed, is a question that he himself seems to have been uncertain about at the time, a fact that he would, with a candor both brave and devastating, later acknowledge publicly. He proposed on the 3rd of February, 1981. They were at Windsor Castle, and the setting, the ancient walls, the long history of the house they stood in, lent the moment a weight that neither of them could have failed to feel. He asked her to be his wife. She said yes. And then she laughed. She described it later as a nervous laugh, the kind that comes when something so large has happened that the ordinary registers of emotional response prove inadequate. But there is something true in the laughter too, something that speaks to the quality she brought to every serious moment, the lightness that lived alongside the depth. She was given time, several days in fact, to consider. Charles or those advising him suggested that she think carefully before accepting, that she understand the scale of what was being asked of her. She went to Australia with her mother, a brief trip, during which she had the landscape and the distance and the particular clarity of the southern hemisphere to help her consider. She considered. She came home. The answer remained yes. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February, 1981. The world, which had been speculating for months with increasing intensity, received the news with a wave of enthusiasm that was immediate, enormous, and entirely unprecedented in recent royal history. This was not simply approval. This was joy, a collective, almost involuntary outpouring of joy from a public that had fixed upon Diana Spencer, this young, fair-haired, slightly shy young woman from a Norfolk estate, and decided instantly and without much deliberation that they loved her. The photographs taken that day are among the most reproduced images in the history of British royal life. Diana in a blue silk suit, the famous blue, the color that would become associated with her, standing beside Charles in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, both of them blinking slightly in the winter light, both of them wearing expressions that combined genuine happiness with something else, something more complex, that the cameras captured faithfully without any of the observers at the time choosing to remark upon it. She looked in those photographs luminous. She also looked very young. She was 19 years old. The interview conducted that afternoon is equally famous, and equally revealing in retrospect. The journalist asked them whether they were in love. Diana said yes, immediately, without hesitation. Charles paused. And then he said, and the phrasing has been examined countless times since, whatever in love means. It was a philosopher's answer to a romantic question. It was also, in the context of the moment, a discordant note so brief and so quickly passed over that almost no one registered it at the time. Diana registered it. She has said so. She heard the pause and the qualification and filed them somewhere, not in the place where she kept her doubts because she had not yet fully assembled her doubts, but in the place where she kept the things she was not yet sure how to think about. The weeks following the engagement were a complete transformation of her existence. She moved out of Coleherne Court, saying goodbye to her flatmates, to the ordinary domestic life she had built there, to the comfortable anonymity of the Earl's Court streets, and into Clarence House, the London residence of the Queen Mother. This was a transitional arrangement, a respectable domestic situation for an engaged woman who could no longer live alone in a flat, governed by the proprieties of a world that had not yet fully updated its ideas about what young women should and should not do. Clarence House was everything Coleherne Court was not. It was grand, formal, historically weighted, staffed by people whose understanding of their roles derived from traditions that predated living memory. It was a house that operated according to rules, not rules that were written down and handed to you on arrival, but rules that were understood, assumed, absorbed through observation of how things were done and how they were not done, and what happened when the distinction between the two was transgressed. Diana arrived at Clarence House with suitcases, and the profound goodwill of a young woman who has said yes to the largest question she has ever been asked, and has not yet discovered the full dimensions of what she has agreed to. She was warmly received by the Queen Mother, who was fond of her and expressed that fondness in the particular idiom of her generation, with small gestures of welcome, with the loan of historical knowledge, with the quiet authority of a woman who had herself, as a young woman, navigated the passage from ordinary life into royal existence and had survived it, had in fact flourished within it. But the Queen Mother had made that passage in 1923, in a world that bore almost no resemblance to the world of 1981. The press in 1923 had been present certainly, but it had operated according to a set of gentlemen's agreements, tacit, largely unwritten but broadly observed, that placed certain boundaries around the private lives of public figures. By 1981, those agreements had dissolved entirely. The press was not merely present. It was everywhere, and it wanted everything. And it had decided that Diana Spencer was the most interesting thing that had happened to it in years. She could not leave Clarence House without being photographed. She could not walk to the car without a crowd assembling. She could not make a public appearance. Even the small, preliminary appearances that were arranged in those early weeks, visits to this institution or that event, occasions designed to introduce her gently to public life, without an intensity of attention that bore no relationship to anything she had previously experienced. The children of Westheath had loved her. The parents at the kindergarten had admired her. London had regarded her with benign indifference. But this was something altogether different. This was the weight of millions of gazes, concentrated on a single young woman, expecting of her something that she was only beginning to understand. She lost weight during these months. This is recorded, and the weight loss is visible in the photographs taken between the engagement and the wedding. A narrowing of the face, a sharpening of the collarbones, a fragility becoming visible beneath the beauty. The explanations given at the time were inadequate. Stress, the demands of wedding preparation, the natural slimming effects of being under scrutiny. The fuller explanation, which would not be available for years, was more complicated and more painful, involving the first stirrings of the eating disorder that would shadow her for the better part of a decade. She was also navigating, in these months, a growing awareness of something she had not fully anticipated, the aloneness of her position. Charles had his own residences, his own schedules, his own life, and the engagement did not substantially reorganize any of these. They did not spend their days together. They did not share the ordinary, incremental intimacies of a couple building a life in common. They met at formal occasions. They corresponded. They were, in the peculiar way of royal engagements, assembling a marriage from a distance, relying on the machinery of institution to substitute for the connective tissue of daily shared experience. She missed her flatmates. She missed the simplicity of the kindergarten, the paint-smeared hands and the loud voices and the uncomplicated love of small children. She missed most fundamentally the private life she had barely had time to appreciate before it was taken from her, the quiet mornings in Earl's Court, the evenings with Carolyn and Virginia and Anne, the ordinary human rhythm of a life lived on a human scale. None of this was, in those months, visible to the outside world. What was visible to the outside world was Diana, radiant at a gala here, luminous at a reception there, her hair a little shorter now, her clothes beginning to acquire the tailoring and formality that the situation required, her smile wide and warm and apparently effortless. She was already extraordinary at this. She had a gift for public presence that no amount of training fully explains, a way of walking into a room and making it feel as though the room had been waiting for her, as though her arrival had answered a question the room had been quietly asking. She was becoming, in those pre-wedding months, something that she had not set out to become and could not quite have predicted. She was becoming Diana. Not Lady Diana Spencer of Coleherne Court and Young England Kindergarten. Not the girl from Park House or the pupil of Westheath. Something larger, more mythic, more public. A figure who was beginning to exceed the dimensions of the person who inhabited her name. The wedding was set for the 29th of July, 1981. The dress was being made in great secrecy by David and Elizabeth Emanuel. The guest list ran to thousands. The plans for the ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, chosen over Westminster Abbey for its greater capacity, its ability to hold the world, were advancing with the precision of a military operation. The route of the carriage procession had been mapped and remapped. The television cameras were being positioned. The world was arranging itself to witness something that had been presented to it as a fairy tale, and that it was ready, desperately ready, to believe in. Diana lay awake in Clarence House, in the formal, beautiful room that had been assigned to her, and the sounds of the house settled around her in the dark, the old house breathing its old breath, the clocks ticking with the patient authority of things that have survived generations. She was 20 years old. She was 5 weeks from her wedding. She was standing at the edge of a life that stretched before her in directions she could not yet see, promising things she could not yet evaluate, requiring things of her that no one had fully described. She closed her eyes in the quiet of Clarence House, and the great machinery of history continued, indifferent to her sleeplessness, to turn. The Cathedral and the Crown, 1981-1982. There are mornings that belong to history before they have even fully begun, mornings that arrive already weighted with the knowledge of what they contain, what they will require, what they will mean to the millions of people who have been waiting for them, with an anticipation that has nothing to do with personal acquaintance, and everything to do with something older and deeper than that. The morning of the 29th of July, 1981, was one of those mornings. London woke early that day. It woke, in fact, barely having slept. The crowds who had claimed their places along the processional route the night before had kept a kind of cheerful, patriotic vigil through the small hours, wrapped in blankets and Union flags, sustained by flasks of tea, and the particular British talent for finding communal warmth in public ceremony. By the time the summer light began to reach across the rooftops of the city, there were already hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral, standing 6 and 8 deep in some places, holding their cameras and their flags and their children aloft, waiting. Inside Clarence House, Diana had been awake since early morning. Sleep had not come easily the night before. This was not a night designed for easy sleep. She had lain in the formal quiet of her room and let the hours pass, listening to London as it prepared itself, hearing in the distance the sounds of a city transforming itself into a stage. By the time her attendants came to begin the process of preparing her for the day, she was already dressed in that particular alertness that belongs to the sleepless, heightened slightly outside herself, moving through the morning with the slightly unreal quality of someone watching their own life from a short distance. The dress had been kept secret with an effectiveness that was, by the standards of the modern media environment, even of 1981, remarkable. David and Elizabeth Emanuel had worked on it for months in conditions of considerable secrecy, the workroom kept locked, fabric scraps disposed of carefully, the details shared with almost no one. They had produced something extraordinary, a gown of ivory taffeta and antique lace, with a 25-foot train that would become one of the most recognizable garments in the history of 20th century fashion. A puffed sleeve construction that was simultaneously romantic and theatrical. A dress that seemed designed not merely to be worn, but to be seen from a very great distance, which was precisely what the occasion required. Watching the dress being prepared, watching the train arranged and rearranged, watching her own reflection assemble itself in the mirror before her, Diana felt something that she later described as a strange calm. The weeks of anxiety, of sleeplessness, of the growing sense that she was moving toward something whose full dimensions she could not assess, all of it seemed to recede in those final hours, replaced by a quality of presence that was entirely characteristic of her. She was here. She was in this room, in this dress, on this morning. Whatever lay ahead, she was going to meet it fully. Her hair was done by Kevin Shanley. Her makeup was applied with the kind of careful artistry that needed to survive both the intimacy of close quarters and the distance of television cameras. The tiara, the Spencer family tiara, a piece of considerable historical significance, featuring delicate floral motifs worked in diamonds, was placed on her head. Earrings. Gloves. The final arrangement of the train. And then the doors of Clarence House opened, and Diana Spencer stepped into the summer morning. The carriage waiting for her was the glass coach, a vehicle with its own considerable history, used for royal occasions since 1910, its design offering the maximum possible visibility to the crowds who had gathered to watch. She entered it with her father, Johnny Spencer, whose health had in recent years been uncertain, following a severe brain hemorrhage in 1978, from which he had recovered, but which had left him altered in ways both visible and invisible. He was proud of her, profoundly, tenderly proud, in the manner of a father who is also on some level astonished by the creature his child has become. He held her hand as the carriage moved off, and she held his, and between them passed something that required no words. The crowds? There is no adequate way to describe the crowds, except to say that they seemed to go on forever. A human landscape stretching the full length of the route, faces turning as one as the glass coach passed, voices rising in a sound that was partly cheering and partly something more elemental than cheering, something that expressed not merely approval but a kind of collective release, as though the people lining those streets had been holding something inside themselves, and the passage of this carriage, this young woman this morning, had given them permission to let it go. She looked out at them through the glass. She saw the flags, the faces, the children on shoulders, the old women with tears on their cheeks, the young men waving with an abandon that suggested they had entirely forgotten they were supposed to be composed. She raised her hand. She smiled, that smile, the one that was already becoming famous. The slight downward cast of the eyes followed by the full upward movement. The smile that somehow managed to suggest both confidence and vulnerability at once, both the awareness of being watched and the capacity to receive that watching without being diminished by it. The route took them through the heart of London, down the Mall, through Trafalgar Square, along the Strand, toward Fleet Street and Ludgate Hill, and the great dome of St. Paul's rising above it all, grey and majestic against the blue of the summer sky. Christopher Wren's cathedral had been chosen for its size. Westminster Abbey, the traditional venue for royal weddings, simply did not have the capacity to accommodate the guest list of 2,500 people, nor the television infrastructure required to broadcast what was already being described accurately as the wedding of the century. St. Paul's had been dressed for the occasion. Inside the nave was banked with flowers, arrangements of white and gold, gardenias and stephanotis and lily of the valley, their scent filling the vast interior with something almost overwhelming in its sweetness. The guests were already in their places. The heads of state, the ambassadors, the representatives of the Commonwealth, the members of the aristocracy, the politicians and the artists, and the military figures and the clergy, all of them arranged within that great interior space with the precision of a ceremony that had been rehearsed and re-rehearsed until it approached the condition of art. The music was extraordinary. The orchestra of the BBC and the choirs of St. Paul's and the New Zealand opera singer Kiri Te Kanawa, whose presence had been kept a near secret until the morning of the wedding, filled the cathedral with sound that seemed to justify its architecture, that rose to the dome and rang there with the authority of something that had been specifically composed for exactly this space, this moment, this purpose. The fanfares composed by David Wilcox. The hymns chosen for their combination of musical grandeur and congregational accessibility. The sound of 2,500 people singing with a conviction that goes beyond the personal and touches something shared, something inherited, something that belongs to the collective memory of a nation. Charles arrived first with his supporters, Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, and took his place at the head of the nave. He was in the uniform of a naval commander, the gold braid catching the cathedral light, his bearing correct and contained in the manner of a man who has been trained since infancy to carry ceremony without letting it carry him. He waited. And then the fanfare announced her. The doors of the cathedral opened, and Diana came in on her father's arm, and the dress came with her, the 25-foot train spreading behind her across the red carpet, the ivory taffeta catching the light, the cathedral filling with the particular quality of held breath that belongs to moments of genuine collective beauty. She walked slowly, because the train required it, and because the aisle of St. Paul's is longer than the aisle of most buildings in England. And the walk required time and deliberateness and the kind of composure that is not merely physical but comes from somewhere deeper. Her father walked beside her, holding her arm, and the slight tremor of age and illness in his bearing made the scene more human, more vulnerable, more real. She looked at Charles as she walked toward him. He looked at her. Later, those who were positioned to observe his expression at that moment described it as one of genuine emotion, not the performed emotion of ceremony, but something more private and more true, a recognition perhaps of the magnitude of what was happening, the irrevocability of it, the way in which the next few minutes would permanently divide his life into before and after. The marriage ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, whose sermon that day was wise and unsentimental in equal measure. He spoke of the courage required by marriage, of the discipline of love, of the way in which a wedding is not merely a celebration but a commitment of the most serious kind, a commitment not to feelings which change, but to a person who is present and real and will become more fully known with time. It is impossible to know whether those words landed differently for Charles and Diana than they did for the 2,500 people listening. It is impossible to know what they heard in that address, what they took from it, what they filed away. Diana made her vows with a clarity and a steadiness that those present remembered afterward. She looked directly at Charles. She spoke in a voice that was audible throughout the cathedral, not loud but present, a voice with weight in it. She made one small, famously reported error. She mixed the order of Charles's names, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George rather than Charles Philip Arthur George, And this mistake, which passed through the cathedral in a small ripple of recognition and was immediately forgiven, made the world love her a little more because it made her human, and she was always at her most powerful when she was human. He placed the ring on her finger. Runcie pronounced them husband and wife. The cathedral erupted. Outside, where screens had been erected along the route, and across Hyde Park and in every major city in the country, and inside every living room where the television was turned on, which was to say, in a very substantial proportion of the living rooms in Britain and around the world, 600 million people watched. 600 million. The number is almost too large to be meaningful, but it is the number that is consistently cited, and it speaks to something that had never quite happened before. A moment in which the new technology of global television broadcasting and the ancient technology of royal spectacle combined to create something whose scale exceeded anything that had previously been possible. The carriage procession back to Buckingham Palace was a kind of triumph. Diana sat beside Charles now, his wife, the Princess of Wales, a title that had not been held for over 70 years, and London gave them everything it had. The noise was continuous, a wall of sound through which the horses moved with their characteristic equine composure, their blinkers in place, their steps measured. Diana waved. She waved and she smiled, and she looked out at the hundreds of thousands of people who had given their Tuesday to this, who had stood on pavements and road dividers and shop steps for hours in order to be present, and she felt, she would later say, a love coming toward her from those crowds that was unlike anything she had previously experienced. Not personal love, precisely. Something larger. Something collective. Something that carried within it the projections and the hopes and the needs of millions of people who had decided, as crowds sometimes do, to concentrate all of that onto a single figure. The balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace was the moment the world had been waiting for. The crowd in the mall below, by some estimates, 600,000 people packed into that broad avenue and its surroundings, began chanting, with the simple, irresistible directness of crowds who know exactly what they want, "Kiss her. Kiss her. Kiss her." Charles turned to Diana with a look that managed to be simultaneously amused and uncertain, and she met the moment with the composure that was becoming her signature, and they kissed, briefly, correctly, a kiss that was nevertheless received by the crowd below with a roar that shook the windows. The wedding breakfast, held within the palace for those invited to the private reception, was an occasion of somewhat more manageable scale. 118 guests, a meal prepared by the palace kitchens, the wedding cake, a confection of 5 tiers, decorated with the Prince of Wales' feathers and floral garlands, cut with a ceremonial sword. The speeches were brief. The champagne was very good. The world was somewhere outside, still vibrating. They departed for their honeymoon that evening, first to Broadlands, the Hampshire estate of the late Lord Mountbatten, which Charles had chosen as a location of personal significance, a place where he could feel the presence of the mentor whose loss still sat heavily with him. Then, aboard the royal yacht Britannia, they sailed through the Mediterranean, Greece, Egypt, the islands of the Aegean, the blue water and the white light of the ancient sea. It should have been perfect. And in some ways it was. The yacht was magnificent, the weather was cooperative, the isolation from the press and the public and the machinery of royal life provided something that neither of them had experienced for months: privacy. But honeymooners need more than privacy. They need ease, and the ease between Charles and Diana in those weeks aboard the Britannia was not always available. They were, in the truest sense, strangers. They had known each other for barely a year in any sustained way, and the nature of their courtship, conducted largely in public, shaped by the conventions of royal protocol, orchestrated as much by the requirements of institution as by the impulses of personal connection, had given them very little of the ordinary shared experience that builds the foundations of a marriage. They had not yet developed the private language of an intimate partnership, the shorthand and the rituals and the in-jokes, and the small daily negotiations that constitute the actual substance of a life lived together. And there were, aboard the Britannia, complications of a more specific kind. Charles brought with him books, stacks of them, philosophy and history and the work of authors whose ideas he was working through, and the hours he spent reading them were hours he was not spending with his new wife. He also brought, in some form that Diana perceived with the acuity that was her most defining quality, the emotional presence of Camilla Parker Bowles. A pair of cufflinks bearing Camilla's initials, given to Charles as a gift, which Diana discovered. Photographs of Camilla that appeared in his diary. A phone call overheard, whose content Diana could not fully make out but whose tone she understood. These were not, in the context of what would later be known about the full dimensions of that relationship, small things. They were the first concrete evidence of something Diana had sensed without being able to name. That she had entered a marriage in which there was already a third presence, a history, a prior emotional claim that had not been dissolved by the wedding and would not be dissolved by it. She did not, on the honeymoon, fully confront this knowledge. She was still too new to the situation, still too much in the process of assembling her own understanding, still sustained by the genuine love she felt for him, and by the hope, the deep, resilient, almost ferocious hope that was one of her most characteristic qualities, that things would find their way to being right. She returned from the honeymoon, visibly thinner. The dress she wore for their arrival in Scotland, where they were to spend the remainder of the summer at Balmoral, hung slightly differently on her frame than it would have 6 weeks earlier. Those who noticed attributed it to the disruptions of travel, the adjustment to married life, the ordinary weight fluctuations of a young woman in a period of significant change. The reality was more complicated. The eating disorder that had first stirred in the weeks of the engagement was becoming, in the stresses of the early marriage, more established. She was beginning to use food, or the refusal of food, as the one area of her new life in which she retained a form of control. Balmoral in the autumn of 1981 was its own particular challenge. The royal family's summer residence in Aberdeenshire is a place that operates according to very specific rhythms: early mornings, outdoor pursuits, the culture of the outdoors as a kind of therapeutic discipline, the evenings in large, slightly chilly rooms with the family gathered around traditions that had been maintained for generations. Diana had visited before the engagement, and had managed the week with the composure of someone performing, rather than participating. Now she was not performing. She was a member of the family. She was expected to inhabit this world, not as a guest but as a resident. She found it difficult. The isolation of Balmoral, which the royal family experienced as restorative, she experienced as loneliness. Charles's days were organized around shooting and walking and the particular physical disciplines of the Highland estate, and she was expected to occupy her own days with the activities available to women in that context: walking, reading, attending to the social rituals of the house. She felt in the long Scottish days an aloneness that was different in kind from the aloneness of Clarence House, because it came without even the noise of London to fill the space between herself and the interior life she was struggling to manage. She missed, with an intensity that surprised even her, the kindergarten. She missed the children. She missed the simplicity and the warmth and the uncomplicated usefulness of that work, the sense available every single day in those Pimlico rooms that she had made a specific and direct difference to specific and real people. Royal life, as she was beginning to experience it, offered a version of that difference: public engagements, charitable connections, the visibility of a position that could be used to draw attention to causes and needs, but in a form so mediated by protocol and schedule and the management of image that it bore almost no resemblance to the direct physical human work she had loved. She was also pregnant. The pregnancy was confirmed in the autumn of 1981, news that was received within the family and then by the public with enormous happiness. She was carrying the heir to the heir, a child who would, in the fullness of time, become the monarch of one of the oldest kingdoms in the world. The pregnancy was physically difficult. Morning sickness in Diana's case was not confined to the mornings, but was a near constant presence through the early months, a relentless nausea that left her exhausted and depleted in ways that the public schedule of a new Princess of Wales did not accommodate. And yet the schedule continued. Because this was the essential, inescapable reality of royal life as Diana was coming to understand it. The schedule continued regardless of what was happening inside the person required to maintain it. She appeared at engagements. She smiled. She shook hands and bent to speak to children, and stood for photographs and said the right things to the right people and performed with extraordinary consistency the role that had been assigned to her. The public, watching all of this, saw something extraordinary and fell further in love. Each new photograph was received with a level of interest that astonished even the newspapers that were generating it. Her clothes became the subject of intense analysis and imitation. Her hair, which she wore short in those early years, the famous feathered cut that had become her signature through the months of the engagement, was copied by women across Britain and beyond. She appeared on magazine covers with a regularity that had no precedent in the history of royal coverage. She was, in the language that would later become the currency of celebrity culture, iconic, though the word was not yet being used in quite that way in 1981. She was also, beneath all of this, in trouble. The eating disorder was intensifying. The loneliness was deepening. The distance between herself and Charles, emotional as well as physical, though often also physical, was not closing but widening. There were arguments. There were silences of a particularly difficult kind. There were moments when she reached toward him, and found that what she reached for was not quite there, or was there in a form so shaped by his own complicated interior life that it could not receive what she was offering. She told very few people. This was partly the training of her background and her generation, the English aristocratic tradition of not airing private difficulties, of maintaining the composed surface regardless of what moved beneath it. It was also partly the particular isolation of her position. She had no peer group within the royal family, no one who had navigated exactly this transition from ordinary life to royal life with the specific vulnerabilities she brought to it. The Queen was kind but formal. Prince Philip was sometimes blunt in ways that, though not unkindly intended, were not always helpful. The Queen Mother was warm but of a generation so different that the gap between her understanding and Diana's experience could not always be bridged. And so she moved into the winter of 1981, carrying her pregnancy and her difficulties and her extraordinary public presence, appearing before the world as something that the world very much needed her to appear as: radiant, serene, the young princess, the new wife, the future mother, while inside the private rooms of her marriage and her interior life, the real work of becoming a person in an impossible situation was underway. It is worth pausing at this moment in the story to note what the world was seeing and why it mattered. Because the global media interest that had gathered around Diana in the months of the courtship had not, with the wedding, subsided or satisfied itself. It had intensified. The wedding had not been the culmination of the story, it had been the opening chapter. Every newspaper in the world that cared about circulation numbers had discovered that Diana Spencer on the front page was a commercial instrument of unprecedented power. Every television network that had broadcast the wedding had seen the numbers: 600 million viewers, an audience that dwarfed anything a sporting event or a political occasion had generated, and understood that they were dealing with a phenomenon rather than a story. The press attention of those post-wedding months was, by the standards of anything Diana had experienced before, extraordinary. She could not attend a public engagement without a bank of cameras recording every moment. She could not appear in a new outfit without the outfit being analyzed, copied, and sold in imitation within weeks. She could not make a small, unrehearsed gesture, bending to talk to a child, laughing at something someone had said, placing her hand on someone's arm, without that gesture being captured and reproduced and discussed as though it contained within it the essential secrets of her character. And the thing is, it did. This was the paradox at the heart of Diana's relationship with the camera, a paradox that would define her for the rest of her life. The gestures were genuine. The warmth was not performed. The moments of connection, and there were dozens of them at every public engagement she attended, small moments of genuine human contact, were real. She was not acting. She was simply being herself, and the camera, which has an instinct for authenticity as reliable as its instinct for falsity, knew it. This was what separated her from every other royal figure of her era, and what made the global fascination with her so durable and so deep. The monarchy, in the Britain of the 1970s and early 1980s, had become associated in the public mind with a quality of noble but slightly remote correctness, with the performance of duty, with the maintenance of tradition, with the careful management of public feeling from a position of dignified distance. Diana did not do distance. Diana moved toward people. She made eye contact. She touched. She listened with her whole face, her whole body, in the way of someone for whom the person in front of them is, in that moment, the only person in the world. The world watching this felt seen. This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about her public effect. She was looked at by hundreds of millions of people, and yet the experience of watching her was somehow reciprocal, somehow personal, as though her openness to the world contained within it a specific acknowledgement of each person looking at her. It is a quality that cannot be manufactured, cannot be taught, cannot be replicated. It was hers. It had been hers since she sat beside a sad child at break time at Riddlesworth Hall, and it would remain hers until the end. The year 1981 ended, and 1982 began. The pregnancy was progressing. The public schedule continued. The newspapers reported her every movement with an appetite that showed no signs of diminishing. Inside Kensington Palace, the London residence to which she and Charles had moved after returning from Balmoral, and which would become her home for the next 16 years, the private reality of the marriage continued to develop along lines that the outside world could not see and was not being invited to imagine. She was 20 years old. She had been married for 6 months. She was carrying a child who would be king. She was the most photographed woman in the world. She was, by any external measure, by every metric that the world knew how to apply, living a life of extraordinary privilege and beauty and historical significance. And she was learning, in the quiet rooms of Kensington Palace, in the early hours of the morning when sleep did not come, in the growing distance between herself and the man she had married, something that all of that privilege and beauty and significance could not teach her and could not protect her from. That the life she was living and the life she was inhabiting were not yet the same thing, and that the distance between them was one of the defining problems of her existence. The cathedral had received her. The crown had claimed her. The world had decided it loved her. And now came the harder, quieter, less photographed work of learning how to live. Motherhood and the Palace Nursery, 1982 to 1985. There are moments in a life that divide everything that came before from everything that comes after, moments so absolute in their transformation of the self, that the person who existed on one side of them and the person who exists on the other share a name and a face, but are in some essential way different creatures. For Diana, the 21st of June 1982, was one of those moments. She had been in labor for 16 hours. The birth took place not in the private wards of a royal residence, but at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington. A decision that was itself quietly significant, a departure from the tradition that had seen royal births conducted behind palace walls, away from the ordinary world. Diana had wanted the hospital. She had wanted the clinical setting, the proximity to medical expertise, the normalcy, if anything about the birth of an heir to the throne of England could be described as normal, of a delivery that took place in the same institution where other women gave birth on the same day without the world gathered outside. Charles was present for the birth. This too was a departure. Royal fathers had not traditionally been present in the delivery room, had waited instead in the formal anteroom of expectation, while the business of producing an heir was conducted by women and physicians behind closed doors. Charles had chosen to be there, and the choice said something about him that complicates the simpler narratives. It said that he was capable, at least in this moment, of crossing the threshold between the ceremonial and the intimate. At 9:03 in the evening, a boy was born. He weighed 7 pounds, 1½ ounces. He had a quantity of fair hair, and the slightly stunned expression of all newborns, who arrive in the world as though they cannot quite account for the brightness of it. Charles emerged from the hospital to tell the waiting press, and there was of course a press contingent outside. There was always a press contingent. This was now simply the condition of Diana's existence, that the baby was in marvelous form, that his wife was well, and that he himself was overwhelmed, a word he used with a simplicity and an openness that those who reported the moment found unexpectedly touching. The child was named William Arthur Philip Lewis. He would be known from the beginning as William. And from the moment Diana first held him, in that first wordless, privately seismic exchange between a mother and her newborn child, something in her reorganized itself around him with a completeness and a permanence that surprised even her. She had always loved children. This was established, thoroughly established, by everything that had preceded this moment: the kindergarten, the animals, the Legat cup for helpfulness, the instinct that ran through her entire childhood toward whatever was small and vulnerable and needed attending to. But this was different from all of that. This was her child. Her child, who had her blue eyes and her fair coloring, and who fitted against her shoulder with the particular rightness of something that belongs exactly where it is. This was the love she had been practicing for, without knowing she was practicing. She told people in the years that followed that William saved her. The statement is large enough to carry considerable weight, and she meant it to. In the difficult months of the early marriage, the loneliness, the eating disorder establishing its hold, the growing awareness of the complications within her relationship with Charles, she had been, beneath the composed public surface, genuinely struggling. William's arrival did not resolve those difficulties. It did not repair what was wrong with the marriage, or dissolve what was problematic in the institution she had joined. But it gave her something that nothing else in her life at that point was giving her. A purpose entirely her own, a relationship of pure and uncomplicated love, a person who needed her in a way that had nothing to do with title or position or the complicated politics of royal life. She was going to be a different kind of royal mother. This was clear from the very beginning, and the clarity came not from any articulated manifesto but from the simple, consistent evidence of her choices. Royal children of previous generations had been managed largely by nannies, professional women who provided the day-to-day care, the feeding and bathing and settling and waking, while the parents maintained a more formal relationship with their offspring, appearing at designated times, applying the particular loving distance that the traditions of English aristocratic parenting had long prescribed. Charles himself had been raised largely in this way, nursed by a nanny, seen by his parents at the intervals that royal schedules permitted, loved but at a remove that was considered appropriate and natural by everyone involved. Diana was not going to do it that way. She engaged a nanny, Barbara Barnes, a warm and capable woman who would remain with the family for several years, but she made clear from the outset that the nanny's role was to assist rather than to substitute. She fed William herself in the early weeks. She got up in the night when he woke. She bathed him. She changed him. She sat with him in the nursery for long hours that had no official designation, no public visibility, no entry in any diary or schedule, hours that were simply the hours of a mother and her child, the accumulation of small, unremarkable moments that constitute the foundation of a person's earliest experience of the world. The nannies who worked for Diana over the years would later describe a nursery environment that was, by the standards of royal households, startlingly ordinary. There was noise, and there was mess, and there were toys on the floor and the particular organized chaos of a household that has a small child moving freely through it. Diana wanted that. She wanted the palace nursery to feel like a home rather than an institution, to have the warmth and the disorder of a real domestic life rather than the managed perfection of a royal one. Kensington Palace, which had been their primary London residence since the latter months of 1981, was not naturally a place that lent itself to informality. It was a royal palace, one of the smaller and more intimate ones by the standards of the Crown's considerable property portfolio, but a palace nonetheless, staffed and maintained according to protocols that had been established over generations and that resisted casual revision. Diana revised them anyway, with the gentle but absolute determination of a woman who has decided what she wants and is not going to be deterred by convention from having it. She pushed William in a pram through the parks of Kensington. She took him to shops. She introduced him, as early as it was possible to do so, to the ordinary world, the world of pavements and other children, and the particular democracy of public space, which makes no distinction between the son of a princess and the son of a postal worker. The press photographed all of this, of course, because the press photographed everything. But even the most cynical of royal correspondents acknowledged that what they were witnessing was not performance. The warmth with which she handled her son, the physical ease of her relationship with him, the way her whole face changed when she looked at him, these were not things that could be manufactured for a camera. She also took William on the first of what would become a defining series of decisions about royal protocol. A decision that announced quietly but unmistakably that she intended to do things differently. When Charles undertook an official tour of Australia and New Zealand in the spring of 1983, Diana insisted that William accompany them. He was 9 months old. The tradition was that royal babies did not accompany their parents on official tours. The precedent, the protocol, the established practice of generations, all pointed in the opposite direction. Diana pointed in her direction instead, and William came. Australia received them with an enthusiasm that made the wedding crowd seem, in retrospect, like a warm-up. The tour was a triumph of a particular and revealing kind, revealing because it demonstrated, conclusively and beyond any possibility of polite denial, what the true engine of public interest was. The crowds came for Diana. They came in numbers that astonished the organizers, that overwhelmed the security arrangements, that reduced grown men and women to weeping in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra. They held signs that said Diana in large letters. They positioned themselves on her side of the road. When the couple divided at an engagement to cover more ground, Charles going one way, Diana another, Charles's side of the street thinned noticeably while Diana's remained dense with people pressing forward to see her. He noticed. He would have had to be insensible not to notice. He made a comment, one of those remarks that pass through a large public event and are heard only by those close enough to be within earshot, but that are remembered precisely because of what they reveal. He said, with a mixture of exasperation and something more complex than exasperation, that he supposed he could have married someone utterly uninteresting and everyone would have been perfectly happy. The remark was not without self-awareness, and it was not without pain. But it was also the first articulation of something that would grow, over the years, into one of the defining tensions of the marriage, the question of who was the story, who was the supporting character, and what it cost a man of Charles's particular formation and pride to inhabit what increasingly felt like the secondary role. Diana was aware of his feelings. She was always aware of feelings. Her antennae for the emotional weather of those around her were too finely calibrated to miss something as significant as her husband's growing discomfort with her public effect. She did not know, in those early years, quite what to do with that awareness. She loved him still. She wanted the marriage to work. She wanted to be the partner he needed, and she understood, intellectually, that her visibility was creating difficulties for him that had nothing to do with any intent on her part. She had not set out to eclipse him. She did not experience herself as eclipsing him. She was simply being herself, and herself in public had this effect, this gathering, magnetizing, love-generating effect that belonged to her as naturally as her eye color. But understanding does not always produce solutions, and the gap between their public personas, his increasingly overshadowed by hers increasingly shaped by the enormous and slightly frightening appetite of the world for everything she did and wore and said and touched, was a gap that the private life of the marriage could not close. The second pregnancy was announced in 1983, and on the 15th of September 1984, Henry Charles Albert David Spencer was born, the child who would be known from the earliest days as Harry. He arrived with red hair and a squalling vitality that immediately distinguished him from his more placid elder brother, and Diana received him with the same absolute reorganizing love that she had given William 2 years earlier. The nursery at Kensington Palace now contained 2 small princes, and Diana occupied it with a completeness and a happiness that those who observed her during those years consistently describe as the truest version of her available to them. Not the luminous princess of the public engagements, not the complicated woman of the marital difficulties, but the mother in the nursery with her boys. She was physically demonstrative with them, in a way that was, for the royal family of that era, genuinely unusual. She held them. She cuddled them. She got down on the floor with them, and played in the entirely uninhibited way of someone for whom the dignity of posture is irrelevant in the face of the pleasure of a child's laughter. There are photographs, informal photographs, taken by friends rather than official photographers, that capture her in these moments, and they have a quality quite different from the official record. They show a woman who is not performing anything. They show someone simply happy. She told both boys that she loved them. She told them constantly, in the daily repetition of ordinary maternal life, in the ways both small and large that constitute a child's earliest understanding of being loved. This was not unremarkable in the context of the world she had joined. The royal family's emotional culture was one in which love was demonstrated through provision and presence and the maintenance of duty, rather than through its verbal and physical expression. Diana's way was different, and she defended it with the quiet ferocity of a woman who has decided that certain things are not negotiable. She also made decisions about their education that continued to signal her intention to do things differently. When William reached school age, she chose a local London school, Mrs. Minor's nursery school in Notting Hill, rather than the private tutoring that royal children had traditionally received in the palace. He was driven to school in a car, but the school itself was an ordinary private nursery, attended by children of various backgrounds, governed by the rhythms and the social dynamics of an institution rather than the managed environment of a palace. Later he went to Wetherby School, also in London. Harry followed in time. The boys grew up knowing, to a degree that their father had not known, what the world outside palace gates looked and smelled and sounded like. This was intentional. Diana had grown up between worlds, between the grandeur of the houses she inhabited and the emotional reality of the life within them. And the knowledge this had given her of what lay beyond the walls of privilege was among the most valuable things she possessed. She wanted her sons to have it too. She wanted them to understand at the earliest possible age that the world contained things, suffering, ordinariness, the needs of people who would never set foot in a palace, that they had a responsibility to acknowledge and in time to address. She took them to homeless shelters. She took them to hospitals where they sat with patients in ways that the patients' families would later describe, with considerable emotion, as having mattered enormously. She was not staging these visits for cameras. They were not for the most part photographed. She was simply doing what she had always done, since the girl who sat beside the lonely child at Riddlesworth Hall, since the young woman who had won the Legat Cup, moving toward the people and the places that needed something, and bringing her children with her so that they might learn by proximity and example what it looked like to give it. Within the marriage, the years from 1982 to 1985 were a period of compounding difficulty. The tenderness that had existed between Charles and Diana in the early months, real, if complicated, was eroding under pressures that came from multiple directions simultaneously, and that the machinery of royal life was entirely unequipped to address. Charles was a man of deep and genuine intellectual seriousness, with interests that ranged across architecture, philosophy, spirituality, and the environment, interests that in the mid-1980s were not always received by his public with the seriousness he felt they deserved. He felt misunderstood, underestimated, overshadowed, within his marriage, within the institution, within the public conversation about the royal family, which was increasingly a conversation about his wife. The frustration this produced in him was not small, and it was not always managed with equanimity. Diana, for her part, was navigating the eating disorder that had now become a significant and frightening presence in her daily life. She was consuming very little, and then, in the pattern that characterizes bulimia, finding herself overwhelmed by the hunger she had been suppressing, binging and purging in a cycle that left her physically depleted and emotionally ashamed. She told very few people. She had attempted to raise the subject with the royal physicians and with those in the household who might have been expected to help, and found, as she described it later, with an eloquence that was also a reproach, that the system she had joined did not quite know what to do with a woman who was asking for help of that kind. Concern was expressed. Appointments were suggested. But the fundamental aloneness of her position within the institution did not change, and it was the aloneness, as much as any other single factor, that was sustaining the disorder. She also struggled with depression, a word she would later use herself plainly and without euphemism in describing those years. The depression was not the paralyzing, bedbound variety that constitutes the most extreme presentations, but something more insidious. A pervasive flatness, a sense of absence from her own life, a feeling of going through motions whose meaning she could not access. It arrived most powerfully in the mornings, when the day arranged itself before her in its official colors, the engagement, the charity visit, the photo call, the smile. And the distance between what was required of her and what she actually felt seemed too large to cross. She crossed it anyway. Every day she crossed it. She put on the suit or the dress or the coat, and she climbed into the car and she walked into the room, and she was immediately, unfailingly, with a professionalism that those who worked with her found almost paradoxically impressive, Diana. Warm and present, and attentive and genuinely interested in every person she met and every cause she visited. The performance was not false. That is the important thing to understand about it. The warmth was real. The interest was real. The attention she gave to every individual who came within its radius was entirely and authentically given. But it cost her. It cost her in ways that the people receiving it could not see and were not intended to see, in the reserves of energy and emotional resource that are not infinite in any human being, however gifted. She came home from public engagements exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. She came home and retreated to the nursery, and sat with her sons, and in their company found something that the public world for all its love could not provide, the simple restorative experience of being needed without being watched. The relationship between Charles and Diana during these years was not a relationship in crisis in any single dramatic sense. It was a relationship in the process of a slower and more insidious deterioration, the kind that happens not through a single rupture, but through the accumulation of small absences and missed connections, through the gradual solidification of patterns that begin as accommodations and end as walls. They were increasingly living parallel lives, their schedules diverging, their interests pulling them in different directions, the emotional language that might have bridged the gap between them becoming year by year more difficult to find. Charles spent significant time at Highgrove, the country house in Gloucestershire that they shared, but that was, in its sensibility and its atmosphere, profoundly his, shaped by his interests, his taste, his passionate engagement with the garden that he was, during these years, developing with a seriousness and a vision that would eventually make it one of the most admired private gardens in England. Diana was not unhappy at Highgrove, particularly in the summers when the boys could run free across its grounds. But it was his place in a way that Kensington Palace, for all its formality, was more nearly hers. The geography of the marriage was itself a kind of map of the distance within it. Camilla Parker Bowles remained. Diana knew this now with a clarity that could no longer be qualified by hope or uncertainty. She did not yet know the full dimensions of what that presence meant, the depth and the durability and the emotional centrality of the relationship between Charles and Camilla. But she knew that there was something there, something that preceded her and had not been displaced by her, something that received from Charles a quality of ease and understanding that their own marriage was not generating. She felt this as a wound that did not heal, that would not be acknowledged, that existed in the official version of her life, as though it did not exist at all. She reached out in these years to the friends she had maintained from her life before the marriage, people from the Coleherne Court years, from the kindergarten, from the social world of her early London life. These friendships were a lifeline, not merely a comfort. They connected her to a version of herself that predated the princess, that remembered the girl in the flat in Earl's Court, that could speak to her without the mediation of title or ceremony. She was fiercely loyal to these friends, and they were loyal in return, and the reciprocity of that loyalty, in a world where loyalty was frequently conditional on proximity to power, was something she understood and valued with a depth that only someone who has experienced its absence can fully appreciate. She was also, during these years, expanding her sense of what her public role could mean. The charitable work that had been part of her official duties from the beginning was becoming in her hands something more than the dutiful attendance at galas and the lending of her name to worthy causes. She was beginning to understand the specific and remarkable tool she possessed, the tool of her own presence, her own warmth, her own ability to make the people she visited feel with complete conviction that she had come specifically for them, that their situation mattered to her personally, that the distance between a princess and a patient in a hospital bed was not, in the moment she chose to cross it, a distance at all. She sat with patients in ways that were not in the protocol. She touched people, she held hands, she embraced, she made the physical contact that communicates, beyond what any words can convey, that another person's suffering is not invisible to you, that it has been seen and acknowledged and received. This was not policy. There was no official directive, no royal instruction to be physically present with the people she visited. It came from the same place that everything in her came from, the deep ineducable instinct of a woman for whom other people's pain was not abstract. The AIDS crisis was beginning in these years to reshape public understanding of disease and stigma, and the terrible arithmetic of suffering. In 1987, Diana would do something that would change the public conversation about AIDS irrevocably. But the foundations of that moment were being laid now in these earlier years, in the gradual expansion of her charitable work and the deepening of her understanding of what it meant to use her visibility in service of people who had been made invisible by their circumstances. In the nursery at Kensington Palace, William was learning to read. Harry was learning to walk, and then to run, and then to do the other things that small children do, with the joyful recklessness of beings who have not yet learned that the world contains edges. Diana watched them. She read to them. She built things with them on the floor and then knocked them down with them, which is, in the economy of small children, the most satisfying part of building. She sang to them at bedtime, not formally, not with the self-consciousness of someone performing a maternal duty, but in the way of a person for whom music is a direct line to the interior, who has always used it as a language when other languages were not quite sufficient. She was in these moments entirely herself. Not the princess, not the most photographed woman in the world, not the troubled wife, not the woman navigating the complicated interior landscape of a difficult few years. She was a mother in a nursery with her children, and the love that flowed between them in those ordinary, unremarkable moments was the realest thing in her life. It would sustain her through what was coming. It would sustain her through the years in which the marriage moved from difficulty toward its formal end, through the public exposure of everything that had been private, through the reinvention of herself as something that the world had never quite seen before. It would sustain her, in fact, to the very end, the knowledge that there were two people in the world who were hers, and for whom she was entirely and unconditionally present. She tucked them in. She turned out the light. She walked through the palace corridors back to the adult world, with its complications and its costs, and its extraordinary, relentless visibility. And she carried them with her always, not as weight but as ballast. As the thing that kept her grounded when everything else was moving. The Cracking Facade of Highgrove, 1985 to 1989. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists only within proximity, the loneliness of two people sharing a house, a table, a public life, and finding in the space between them a distance that no amount of physical closeness can close. It is a loneliness more acute than solitude, because solitude at least has the honesty of its own emptiness. This other kind, the loneliness of a marriage that has stopped working while the world continues to believe that it is working beautifully, has no honest name, and no acknowledged place in the official record of a life. It simply exists, in the mornings and the evenings and the long silences between engagements, in the particular quality of two people sitting in a room together and finding nothing adequate to say. By 1985, this was the interior reality of the marriage between Charles and Diana. The exterior reality, the official version, the one that appeared in photographs and court circulars, and the managed communications of the palace press office, remained on its surface intact. They appeared together. They smiled. They fulfilled their duties with the professionalism that both of them, whatever their private difficulties, were entirely capable of sustaining in public. But those who worked closely with them, who occupied the same houses and arranged the same schedules, and were present in the margins of their private lives, were beginning to see things that the public record did not contain. Highgrove House, the Gloucestershire estate that Charles had purchased in 1980, was, by the mid-1980s, the primary theatre of the marriage's private life. It was a handsome, somewhat severe Georgian house set in 500 acres of Gloucestershire countryside, not the grandest of the royal residences, but one that Charles had made emphatically and personally his own, particularly through the garden, which he was developing with a passion and a vision that those who later came to know it described as bordering on the obsessive in the best possible sense. He loved Highgrove. He loved the garden with a specificity and an absorption that constituted for him a form of spiritual practice, the turning of earth, the discipline of planting and pruning and waiting, the relationship with something growing that asked nothing of him except patience and attention. Diana did not dislike Highgrove. She found the house itself comfortable, and the Gloucestershire countryside genuinely beautiful, particularly in the summer months when the garden was in its fullest expression, and the evenings were long and golden, and the boys could run free across the lawns without the managed constraints of palace life. But Highgrove was, in its atmosphere and its sensibility, and the social world it gathered around itself, Charles's place, and the subtle but persistent experience of inhabiting someone else's space, of being a guest in the defining environment of your own marriage, was one that accumulated in her with a weight she found increasingly difficult to carry. The social world of Highgrove in the mid-1980s was largely the social world of Charles's interests and friendships. People who shared his enthusiasm for organic farming, for architecture, for the philosophical and spiritual questions that increasingly occupied his interior life, for the particular register of intellectual seriousness that he brought to everything he cared about. These were not, for the most part, Diana's people. Not because she was incapable of intellectual engagement. She was, in fact, considerably more intelligent than those who reduced her to her beauty and her wardrobe ever acknowledged, but because the specific idiom of those conversations, the particular cultural and intellectual shorthand of that world, was one she had not been educated into, and had not had the time or the inclination to acquire. She felt, at Highgrove dinner tables, the particular discomfort of a person who is present but not quite included, who can follow the conversation well enough to know what is being discussed, but cannot enter it in the way that those around her enter it, with the ease of shared reference and mutual assumption. She was warm at those dinners. She was charming. She asked questions, and listened to the answers with the quality of attention that was entirely characteristic of her. But she returned from them with a tiredness that was more than physical, the tiredness of sustained performance in a register that was not naturally hers. And then there was Camilla. The social world of Highgrove was also inevitably the social world that contained Camilla Parker Bowles. She and her husband Andrew were among the Gloucestershire set, neighbors in the particular sense in which the English countryside uses that word, meaning not the house next door but the overlapping network of people who share a landscape and a social calendar, and the inspoken assumptions of a certain way of English life. Their home, Bolahide Manor and later Middlewick House, was not far from Highgrove. They appeared at the same gatherings. They moved through the same rooms. Diana watched this. She watched it with the acute perceptiveness that had been her most consistent characteristic since childhood, the same quality that had let her read her parents' marriage in the silences of Park House, the same quality that had made her attuned, from the earliest days of her relationship with Charles, to the things that were present but not spoken. What she observed over the years at Highgrove was the specific texture of the relationship between her husband and this woman, the ease of it, the history embedded in it, the particular quality of relaxation that Charles achieved in Camilla's company that he did not achieve, or did not achieve in quite the same way in hers. She confronted it. This is the part of the story that the more sanitized versions tend to elide, but Diana was not, ultimately, a woman who could indefinitely sustain the performance of not seeing what was directly in front of her. She raised it with Charles. She raised it in the way of a woman who has been carrying something too heavy for too long, and has finally found, or forced the moment to put it down and require that it be looked at. The conversations were, by her later account, painful in ways that went beyond the content of what was said, painful because of Charles's responses, which were variously dismissive, evasive, and occasionally so interior and qualified as to constitute a form of non-engagement more frustrating than direct denial would have been. He did not, she said, make her feel that her concerns were legitimate. He did not make her feel that the marriage contained, in his emotional understanding, the same expectations that it contained in hers. And in this, in the particular quality of what she received when she reached toward him with the most difficult things, she encountered the deepest form of her marital loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically apart, which was manageable, but the loneliness of being emotionally unmet, of speaking and finding that the quality of listening on the other side was insufficient to receive what was being said. The palace as an institution was not a resource she could draw upon. This needs to be stated plainly, because it is one of the most significant and consequential facts about Diana's experience of these years. The royal family is, and was, an institution of great sophistication in some respects, in the management of ceremony, in the maintenance of tradition, in the projection of continuity and stability to a watching world. But it was, in the mid-1980s, an institution almost entirely without the vocabulary or the infrastructure to address the mental and emotional difficulties of its members. The idea that a Princess of Wales might need professional psychological support, might be struggling with an eating disorder, might be experiencing depression of clinical significance, these were not concepts that the institution was equipped to receive and respond to with appropriate care. The responses she did receive, when she attempted to communicate her difficulties within the system, tended to take one of two forms. The first was a kind of benign incomprehension, the expression of concern by people who genuinely did not know what to do with what she was telling them, who had no framework for understanding it, and therefore defaulted to the suggestion that things would improve with time and equanimity. The second was something closer to institutional management, the sense, barely beneath the surface of certain conversations, that the primary concern was not Diana's well-being but the smooth functioning of the public machine, and that her difficulties, to the extent that they threatened to disrupt that functioning, were themselves the problem. She was not without support entirely. She had, by the mid-1980s, assembled around herself a small number of people, friends, confidants, a therapist she began seeing during these years, who constituted an informal architecture of care that the institution was failing to provide. She leaned on these relationships heavily, with the dependency of someone who has identified the places where warmth is available, and learned to return to them consistently. Her friends from the years before the marriage, the people who had known her as Diana Spencer of Coleherne Court, who remembered the girl who cleaned and cooked and worked in the kindergarten, were particularly precious to her. They were the custodians of a version of herself that the palace was not equipped to honor. She was also, in these years, beginning to understand her own power in a new and more conscious way. The Australian tour of 1983 had demonstrated something that subsequent official engagements had confirmed and reconfirmed, that her effect on the people she met was extraordinary and was hers, not borrowed from her title or her marriage or the institution she represented. She was beginning to understand that this was a tool, and that the question of how to use it was one she could, to some degree, decide for herself. Her charitable work expanded and deepened through the mid-1980s, with a purposefulness that went beyond the fulfillment of official duty. She was patron of numerous organizations, Bernardo's Help the Aged, the Royal Academy of Music, but the patronages that mattered most to her were those that placed her in direct contact with the people she was there to support. She visited hospices. She sat with patients who were dying, and held their hands and spoke to them with the quiet, unfrightened directness of someone who does not pretend that death is not in the room. She went to addiction centers and psychiatric units and shelters for the homeless, and in each of these places she brought the same thing she always brought, herself, unmediated, present, genuinely and visibly moved by what she encountered. The people she visited spoke about it afterward with a consistency that amounts to its own kind of testimony. There was something different about her visits, they said. There was something that happened in the room when she came in that was not simply celebrity or glamour or the novelty of royalty. It was something more personal than any of those things, and more sustaining. She made them feel, these people who had frequently felt made invisible by their circumstances, that they were seen. That someone of significance had come specifically to see them, and had arrived without the protective distance that most people of significance maintain when visiting the uncomfortable edges of experience. This quality, this radical, almost disarming openness to suffering, was not something she had been trained into or had acquired through experience of official duties. It was something she had brought with her from childhood, from the girl who had wept over injured animals and sat beside lonely children and won the Legat Cup for helpfulness. But the years of her own suffering, the eating disorder, the depression, the loneliness of the marriage, had deepened it in ways that made it, by the mid-1980s, something qualitatively different from what it had been. She knew now, in the most intimate and personal way, what it felt like to be in difficulty within an environment that did not know how to help. She knew what it was to be in pain, and to find the official responses to that pain inadequate. And she brought that knowledge with her into every room she entered, and the people in those rooms felt it, and it mattered to them enormously. In 1987, she did the thing for which she would, in the history of public health communication, perhaps be most lastingly remembered. She visited the HIV/AIDS ward at the Middlesex Hospital in London, and she sat beside a patient, a man who was dying, who had lived through the particular horror of a disease that in those years carried not merely its physical devastation, but the enormous additional weight of public stigma and social abandonment, and she shook his hand. Without gloves. It seems from the distance of the present, a small gesture. It was not small. The AIDS crisis of the 1980s was, among its many dimensions, a crisis of touch. A crisis generated by the widespread and medically unfounded fear that the virus could be transmitted through ordinary physical contact. a fear that had translated into the practical abandonment of the sick by people who might otherwise have been present for them. Diana shook that man's hand and the cameras captured it, and the image went around the world, and in its passage around the world, it accomplished something that government health campaigns and medical announcements and newspaper articles had been attempting and failing to accomplish for years. It told the watching world, with the specific authority of her particular visibility, that these people were touchable. That they were people. That their suffering was not a punishment, and their presence was not a danger, and their need for human contact was not a thing to be withheld. She had not planned it as a campaign. She had not consulted with communications professionals, or assessed the media impact, or constructed a strategy. She had gone to visit people who were ill, and she had done what she always did. She had touched them because touching people who needed to be touched was simply what she did and always had done. The fact that it changed the public conversation about one of the defining health crises of the 20th century is a measure of something that resists easy analysis, the specific power that arises from the combination of genuine feeling and extraordinary visibility, the way in which, in her hands and almost uniquely in her hands, the personal became effortlessly and without contrivance the political. Back within the walls of the royal court, the position Diana occupied was becoming increasingly complicated in ways that had little to do with public engagements, and everything to do with the internal politics of an institution under strain. The royal family is not, and has never been, a simple family. It is a family that is also a constitutional entity, a public institution, a commercial enterprise of considerable scale, and a symbol whose value is denominated in the currency of public trust. The management of all of these things simultaneously requires a particular kind of institutional coherence, and by the mid-1980s, the difficulties within the Wales marriage were beginning to threaten that coherence in ways that the palace found profoundly uncomfortable. The response to this discomfort was not to address the underlying difficulties, to provide Diana with the support she needed, to mediate between her and Charles with any genuine commitment to their welfare as people, but to manage the situation, which is what institutions do when their primary commitment is to the institution rather than to the individuals within it. Management, in this context, meant the careful control of information, the maintenance of the public image of the marriage as something more functional than it actually was, the suppression of stories that might complicate that image, the gentle but persistent pressure on Diana to continue performing the role she had been assigned without drawing attention to the difficulties the performance was costing her. She felt this pressure with great clarity, and her response to it was complicated. On one level, she understood the institutional imperatives and was not entirely unsympathetic to them. She did not want to damage the monarchy. She did not want to become a story that harmed an institution she still at this point believed in and was committed to serving. On another level, the requirement to maintain a fiction, to appear in public as one half of a successful royal marriage while living in private the reality of something very different, was a requirement that sat with increasing discomfort against the core of who she was. Diana was not, constitutionally, a woman who could sustain indefinitely the gap between inner truth and outer performance. She was too aware, too feeling, too possessed of the particular kind of radical honesty that comes to people who have experienced, early and deeply, the cost of things not being spoken. The family she had grown up in had conducted its difficulties in silences and coded communications and the maintained facades of the English aristocratic tradition, and she had grown up breathing that atmosphere and knowing, with the absolute certainty of a child who senses without being told, that something important was not being said. She did not want to replicate it. She had not chosen to replicate it. But here she was, inside it again, inside the architecture of unsaid things, performing the surface while the substance remained unacknowledged. Her mental health in these years requires honest acknowledgement, because she herself, in later years, insisted on that honesty with a courage that was among the most significant things she ever did. The bulimia had not abated. It had, if anything, intensified during the periods of greatest stress, the confrontations about Camilla, the difficult stretches of the public schedule, the mornings when the distance between the life she was living and the life she wanted felt unbridgeable. It was a coping mechanism, and it was a self-destructive one, and she knew it was both of those things simultaneously, which is one of the most terrible aspects of that particular disorder, the knowledge coexisting with the compulsion, the understanding unable to override the behavior. She spoke about it in these years to very few people. To her therapist. To one or two friends. Not to her husband, whose responses to her emotional disclosures had not by this point generated sufficient trust to invite further ones. Not to the palace, whose capacity to help had been demonstrated to her as inadequate. She carried it in the way of someone who has learned that carrying is what is required, who has looked at the available alternatives and found none of them sufficient. The isolation within the royal court deepened as the decade progressed. The court is, in certain respects, a medieval institution that has survived into the modern world. It operates through proximity to the monarch, through the management of access and favor, through the social dynamics of people who understand that their position depends on their relationship with power. Diana occupied a position within this system that was simultaneously central and peripheral. Central because she was the Princess of Wales, the most visible member of the royal family after the Queen herself, the woman whose face appeared on the front pages of the world's newspapers with a regularity that had no precedent. Peripheral because the interior culture of the court had not made room for her, had not adjusted its assumptions and its rhythms and its emotional register to accommodate someone who was constitutionally unsuited to its particular requirements. There were people within the household who were kind to her. There were members of the royal staff who understood, or at least sensed, that she was struggling, and who found ways to make her daily existence more bearable. Small gestures of warmth and humanity that she remembered with great gratitude for the rest of her life, because she understood what it cost people within that system to extend them. But there were also people who were not kind, people who found her difficult or threatening, or simply too loud an instrument for the particular music of their world, and their unkindness, however small in scale, registered with someone as sensitively attuned as Diana with a precision and a lasting quality that more robust temperaments might not have experienced. Charles, for his part, was also struggling. This is important to acknowledge, because the story of these years is not adequately told as the story of a villain and a victim. It is more interesting and more human and more painful than that. Charles was a man who had entered a marriage carrying his own considerable freight. The weight of duty, the loneliness of an unusual upbringing, the emotional constraints of a formation that had given him very little practice in the kind of direct, undefended intimacy that Diana both needed and offered. He had made choices in his marriage that caused her enormous pain, and those choices were not excusable. But they were made by a person who was himself, in his own way, lost, who found in Camilla the ease and the understanding that his marriage, for whatever combination of reasons, was not providing, and who was not able to summon the courage or the clarity to resolve the conflict between his obligations and his inclinations. The Highgrove years, then, were years of a marriage slowly finding its final form, not through a single rupture but through the patient, unglamorous work of two people discovering that they could not give each other what they needed, that the gap between them was not temporary, and was not going to be closed by time or goodwill or the continued maintenance of appearances. The facade was cracking. Anyone close enough to press their ear to it could hear the sound. But the facade was also, from the outside, still considerable, still capable of generating the photographs and the public appearances and the impression of a marriage that was, whatever its private complexities, essentially intact. The world believed in the marriage because it wanted to, and because Diana, every time she appeared in public, gave it something genuine to believe in. Not the marriage exactly. She was too honest, in her body and her face and the language of her physical presence, to perform contentment she did not feel with complete conviction. But she gave the world herself, warm, present, luminous with the particular light that never left her regardless of what it cost to maintain. And the world, receiving this, concluded that everything must be well enough. It was not well enough. But it was also not yet over. And the years between now and the moment of final reckoning were going to contain things: public revelations, private crises, acts of extraordinary courage and self-assertion, that no one looking at the composed surface of these Highgrove years could yet have predicted. She stood in the garden at Highgrove on an autumn evening, the light going gold across the lawns, the boys inside with the nanny, the house behind her full of its complicated silences. The garden was beautiful. She had always been willing to acknowledge its beauty, even when everything else she might have said about Highgrove was too difficult to say. She stood there for a while in the fading light, in the garden that was not quite hers, in the marriage that was not quite working, in the life that the world had decided was a fairy tale. And then she went inside, the handshake that changed the world, 1989 to 1991. There are gestures that exceed their own dimensions, small physical acts that carry within them, at the moment of their making, a weight far in excess of what any single movement of a human hand should be able to bear. They occur at the intersection of the personal and the historical, at the precise point where one person's instinct collides with the world's need, and when they occur in the full light of the modern media, they do not merely communicate, they transform. They shift something in the collective understanding that cannot be shifted back. They make a before and an after, and the world on the after side is measurably, verifiably different from the world on the before side. Diana had made such gestures before. She had made them quietly, in hospices and hospitals and shelters, in rooms where cameras were not always present and the witnesses were few, and the significance was felt rather than recorded. But by the late 1980s, the gesture that would define her legacy in this particular register had already been made, in the corridor of the Middlesex Hospital in April of 1987, when she had sat beside a man dying of AIDS and taken his hand in hers without the barrier of a glove. And the world that existed on the other side of that moment was different in ways that were still, in the years between 1989 and 1991, continuing to unfold. To understand what that handshake meant, it is necessary to understand what AIDS meant in the Britain of the late 1980s. The disease had arrived in public consciousness, at the beginning of the decade, as something terrifying and poorly understood, associated in the popular imagination, and shamefully in significant portions of the official response, with communities already marginalized by the mainstream of society. Gay men, intravenous drug users, people who occupied the edges of social acceptability, whose suffering was too easily categorized by those who did not wish to engage with it as a consequence of choices rather than a claim upon the general conscience. The government response in Britain had been, in the earlier years of the crisis, characterized more by the politics of discomfort than by the imperatives of public health. There had been campaigns, the notorious tombstone advertisements of 1986, stark and frightening, designed to communicate the seriousness of the epidemic without quite resolving the political difficulty of discussing it honestly in the context of the communities most affected. There had been parliamentary debates of considerable acrimony. There had been newspapers whose coverage of the crisis managed, with a consistency that was its own form of editorial policy, to produce more stigma than information. And there had been, as a direct consequence of all of this, a climate in which the people most affected by AIDS were living and dying inside a compound suffering, the suffering of the disease itself, and the suffering of the public conversation about it, which had assigned to them a form of blame that made the ordinary human responses of sympathy and solidarity extraordinarily difficult for the general public to extend. Into this climate, in April of 1987, Diana had walked. She had walked into the HIV/AIDS ward at the Middlesex Hospital not as a campaigner or an activist or a person with a developed public health agenda, but as herself. As a woman who visited people who were ill because that was what she did, who brought to those visits the same unguarded warmth and physical openness that she brought to every room she entered, who did not possess in any meaningful sense the instinct for protective distance that most people maintain when encountering something frightening. The man whose hand she took was not identified by name in the accounts of the visit that were later published. He was a patient. He was dying. He was, in the calculus of the crisis, as the public had been invited to understand it, one of those people, one of the people whom the prevailing culture had decided to regard with a mixture of pity and judgment that made genuine human contact enormously difficult to offer. Diana sat beside him and took his hand, and the photographer present captured the image, and the image went to the front pages of newspapers across Britain and across the world, and the world looked at it and understood something that no tombstone advertisement and no parliamentary debate had been able to communicate. If she could touch him, they could touch him. If she, the most visible woman in the world, the woman whom the public had adopted as their own, the woman whose approval was sought by governments and whose presence transformed the room she entered, if she could sit beside this man without fear and without distance and take his hand in hers, then the fear and the distance were not necessary. were not in fact rational, were the product of ignorance and stigma rather than of medical reality. The handshake was, in this sense, the most efficient piece of public health communication of the decade, more efficient than any campaign, any advertisement, any government initiative, because it operated at the level of feeling rather than information, and feelings in the economy of human behavior are considerably more powerful than facts. She returned to AIDS work in the years that followed not as a one-time gesture but as a sustained commitment, and the distinction matters. It would have been entirely possible, politically easier, institutionally less complicated, for her to make the visit to the Middlesex, accept the praise that followed, and return to a more comfortable register of charitable engagement. She did not do this. She came back. She visited more wards, more hospices, more of the places where people with AIDS were living and dying, and she came to each of these places with the same quality of presence she had brought to the first visit, personal, physical, unfrightened, entirely without the professional distance that most public figures maintain when engaging with the difficult edges of experience. She held dying men in her arms. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is a description of what she actually did, in the private wards and hospice rooms she visited, away from official photographers, in the company only of the patients and their carers and the small number of people who accompanied her. She held them and she talked to them and she listened to them and she made them feel. The testimony of those who were present is consistent on this point, consistent enough to constitute something beyond individual impression, that their lives had been seen by someone who understood their value. The gay community, which was bearing the greatest burden of the crisis in Britain, received her with a love and a gratitude that went beyond what could be accounted for by the official role she held. She was not a politician who could change policy. She was not a scientist who could accelerate a treatment. She was a woman who showed up, consistently and personally, in the places where they were suffering, and brought with her the specific and irreplaceable thing that she alone could bring, the signal broadcast to a watching world, that these people mattered, that their suffering was not invisible, that the distance between their world and the world of mainstream society and official approval was a distance she was choosing to cross. She became, in these years, a figure of genuine significance to communities that had previously had very little reason to feel that the institution of the monarchy had anything to offer them. This was not a political or an ideological position that she had arrived at through argument. She was not, in any conventional sense, a politically radical figure, and she did not engage with the structural dimensions of the crisis in the way that activist organizations were doing. What she offered was something more intimate than politics and, in certain respects, more powerful, the simple human acknowledgement performed in her own body and her own presence that the people in front of her were people. The fashion dimension of these years requires a different kind of attention, not because it is less significant than the humanitarian work, but because it operates in an entirely different register and demands to be understood in its own terms. By the late 1980s, Diana had become something that the English language was only just developing the vocabulary to describe. She had become, in the full modern sense of the word, a fashion icon. The process by which this had happened was neither straightforward nor entirely under her control. In the early years of the marriage, her clothes had been chosen and managed by others, by the advisors and dressers and protocol officials who understood what a Princess of Wales was supposed to wear, and who supplied that understanding in the form of structured suits and pearl chokers and the carefully managed conservatism of official royal fashion. She had worn these things dutifully, and the world had photographed her wearing them, and the world had concluded that she was beautiful in them because she was beautiful in everything. But they were not precisely her. The evolution that took place through the mid to late 1980s was the evolution of a woman gradually, and then decisively, claiming her own aesthetic. It happened in increments, a slightly bolder color here, a more decisively cut silhouette there, the gradual replacement of the safe and approved with something that was beginning to express, in the language of cloth and cut and color that fashion speaks, something more genuinely personal. She worked with designers who understood not merely what she should wear, but what she wanted to wear. Catherine Walker, whose long partnership with Diana produced some of the most memorable garments in the history of royal fashion. Victor Edelstein, whose midnight blue velvet gown she wore to the White House in 1985, the night she danced with John Travolta in an image that became one of the defining photographs of the decade, Bruce Oldfield. Versace, whose more flamboyant idiom she would explore in the later years with an increasing boldness that reflected her growing freedom. What made Diana's relationship with fashion significant, what elevated it above the ordinary celebrity endorsement of designer clothes, and what made her uniquely an icon rather than simply a well-dressed woman, was the fact that her clothes were always in some kind of dialogue with her situation. She dressed, at a level that may have been partly instinctive rather than entirely calculated, in ways that communicated something about her interior life and her public position that words were not always available to say. The shy, slightly fragile girl of the early photographs, in her ruffled blouses and her Laura Ashley prints. The increasingly assured young woman of the mid-decade, in her structured shouldered jackets and her confident primary colors. And then, from the late 1980s onward, something else, something more deliberately powerful, more consciously individual, more willing to use the language of fashion to make a statement that exceeded the merely sartorial. She began to wear clothes that were not safe. This is the significant development of the period, and it should be understood for what it was, not a superficial change of aesthetic preference, but a form of communication, conducted in the only medium that was entirely hers, about who she was becoming and what she was no longer willing to conceal. The black strapless dress she wore to a Vanity Fair event in 1994, though that falls beyond these years, is the most famous example of this tendency, but its roots lie in the choices of the late 1980s, when she began, gradually and then decisively, to use her appearance not as a performance of royal conformity but as an expression of self. She was also, during these years, extending her humanitarian reach in ways that went beyond the AIDS work that had made her internationally famous in this register. She was visiting the homeless in London, not in the managed format of an official visit, but directly, sometimes arriving unannounced at shelters to sit with people sleeping rough, to hear their stories, to make the same quality of contact she made everywhere she went. She was working with children's charities, with a depth of personal engagement that went well beyond the nominal patronage that royal association with charitable causes usually involves. She was spending time at Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children in London, where her relationship with the patients and the staff had the quality not of an official visit, but of something closer to genuine friendship. The children she met in hospitals were perhaps the encounters that most completely reunited her public role with her deepest instincts. She was wonderful with sick children, not in the performed, careful way of someone who has been briefed on how to approach a child with a serious illness, but in the natural way of someone for whom a child in difficulty is simply someone to be present with, fully and without agenda. She sat on hospital beds. She held children who were frightened. She spoke to them in the register, direct, warm, honest, occasionally funny, that children respond to and that adults who are frightened of saying the wrong thing rarely manage to sustain. And she spoke to their parents too, with an understanding of what it meant to love a child who was suffering, that went beyond empathy into something more visceral and personal, the understanding of a mother. William and Harry were growing through these years with the particular energy of boys who have been given both enormous privilege and, unusually for their position, a mother who was determined to keep them connected to the ordinary world. William was 7, 8, 9 in these years, old enough to be aware at some level of the complications of his family's situation, though too young to fully understand them. Harry was 5, 6, 7, still largely in the golden obliviousness of early childhood, still fully contained within the warm domestic world that Diana maintained for them with such fierce and determined consistency. She was present for them in ways that required significant negotiation with the demands of the official schedule. There were school runs. There were bedtimes that she protected against the encroachments of official engagements with a firmness that those who managed her diary found at times difficult. There were holidays. She took them skiing at Closters, to the Caribbean with the Fiades, to the ordinary summer pleasures of beaches and ice cream, and the freedom from the protocol that governed every other dimension of their lives. In these photographs, and they were photographed, because they were always photographed, she appears as close to unclouded as the record of these years shows her. The happiness in those images is specific and genuine and distinctly different in quality from the professional warmth of the public engagements. This is the happiness of a mother with her children, and it is the realest thing in the picture. She was also, through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, doing something that would not become fully visible to the world for some years yet. She was thinking. She was, in the gradual and serious way of a person who has been told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that they are not an intellectual, discovering that the assessment was wrong. She was reading. She was talking to people, therapists, spiritual advisors, friends with expertise in the areas that were beginning to interest her, experts in the fields her charitable work brought her into contact with, and she was assembling from these conversations and from her own experience and from the vast and accelerating education that her public life was providing a worldview. A set of ideas about what mattered and why. A philosophy, if that word is not too formal for something that was as much felt as reasoned, about the relationship between power and responsibility, between visibility and obligation, between the accident of her position and the use she was going to make of it. She was not, it should be said, at peace during these years. The marriage was continuing its slow dissolution. The eating disorder remained present, a companion she had not chosen and could not dismiss, though the therapeutic work she was doing was beginning incrementally to shift her relationship with it. The isolation within the court was, if anything, deepening. The official world around her was responding to the growing public sense of her as a figure who exceeded the institutional frame, with a mixture of admiration and anxiety that did not always resolve in her favor. There were those within the palace who found her increasingly difficult to manage, and management, as she had come to understand with considerable clarity, was how the institution tended to think about its members. Not as people with needs and gifts and the right to self-determination, but as components of a larger system whose smooth functioning was the primary value. She was becoming harder to manage. This was not an accident or a failure of institutional strategy. It was the natural consequence of a woman becoming, year by year, more fully herself. The girl who had arrived at Clarence House in 1981, young, eager to please, uncertain of her own authority, constitutionally inclined toward accommodation, was becoming someone else. She was becoming a woman who knew what she valued and was willing, with increasing frequency and decreasing apology, to act on that knowledge. The AIDS work was part of this. The fashion was part of this. The fierce protection of her son's right to a normal childhood was part of this. All of it was the same underlying movement, the movement of a self into its own full possession, the gradual, costly, irreversible process of becoming. The world, watching all of this, was responding in ways that continued to astonish those who monitored such things. Her popularity was not diminishing. It was, if anything, intensifying, deepening from the initial reflexive love of a public that had been captivated by a fairy tale into something more substantial, more considered, more like the love that is earned rather than the love that is given freely at the beginning of a story. People were beginning to understand in these years that Diana was not simply beautiful and charming and well-dressed. They were beginning to understand that she was also brave, that the hospital visits and the AIDS wards and the shelters for the homeless were not the easy performances of a woman playing at charity, but the genuine commitments of a person who had decided at some fundamental level what her life was for. In 1991, she visited a leprosy hospital in Indonesia during an official tour. Leprosy, like AIDS, like the other conditions she had chosen to engage with directly, carried its own burden of stigma, its own history of the sufferer's exclusion from the sympathy of the healthy. She sat with the patients. She touched them. She made the photographs that went around the world and told the watching world what she had come to tell it, in the only language she had ever fully trusted, the language of her own body, her own presence, her own refusal to maintain the distance that fear and convention recommended. She was becoming, in these years, something that had no precise precedent in the history of the institution she represented. Not the royal patron, who lends a name to a charity and appears at the annual gala. Not the celebrity who adopts a cause for the purpose of profile management. Something more complicated and more interesting than either. A woman whose public role and private self were engaged in a continuous, sometimes painful, ultimately productive negotiation about what it meant to have the world's attention and to decide, deliberately and repeatedly, to spend it on the people the world preferred not to look at. She stood in the wards and the shelters and the hospices of the late 1980s and early 1990s and she looked directly at what the world looked away from. And she brought the cameras with her not because she needed the cameras, but because the cameras were the mechanism by which her looking became the world's looking, by which her refusal of distance became a collective permission to be less afraid. This was the handshake that changed the world. Not a single gesture in a single hospital corridor, on a single April afternoon, though that gesture was real and its consequences were real, and the man whose hand she held deserved to have it remembered. But the larger handshake, the sustained, repeated, deliberate extension of herself toward the people and the conditions that the world had chosen to hold at arm's length, that was the thing. That was what she was doing in these years, and what she would continue to do with increasing conviction and decreasing concern for the institutional consequences for the remainder of her life. The world felt it. The world felt it in the specific, embodied way that Diana always communicated, not through argument or policy or the careful management of public messaging, but through the simple, radical act of showing up, of being present, of refusing, with a consistency that became over time a form of testimony, to look away. The Secret Tapes of Kensington, 1991-1992. There are acts of courage that announce themselves as courage from the beginning, that arrive with the clarity of a decision made in full knowledge of its consequences, embraced with open eyes and a steady heart. And then there are acts of courage that begin as something else entirely, as need, as desperation, as the last available option of a person who has exhausted every other means of being heard, and that only reveal their true dimensions in retrospect, when the world has had time to understand what was at stake and what it cost to do the thing that was done. Diana's decision to speak to Andrew Morton was both of these things. It was desperate and it was brave, and it was the act of a woman who had arrived by the early months of 1991 at a place where the alternative to speaking, the continuation of the silence, the maintenance of the fiction, the endless performance of a life that bore diminishing resemblance to the life she was actually living, had become more frightening to her than the consequences of breaking it. She had been silent for a long time. She had been silent through the courtship and the wedding and the honeymoon and the early years of the marriage, when she had hoped that silence was temporary, that things would improve, that the love she felt and the commitment she had made would find a way to build something sustainable from the unpromising materials available. She had been silent through the births of her children, and the deepening of the marital difficulties, and the gradual, undeniable confirmation of what she had long suspected about Camilla. She had been silent through the eating disorder and the depression and the encounters with the palace machinery that had made clear to her, with a consistency that admitted of no alternative interpretation, that the institution's primary concern was its own preservation rather than her welfare. The silence had not protected her. It had not protected the marriage, or improved it, or generated the changes within the institution that might have made the marriage more survivable. What it had done was to protect the official version of her life, the version in which the Princess of Wales was serene and fulfilled and well supported, in which the marriage was complicated but fundamentally sound, in which the royal family was a functioning unit capable of managing its own internal difficulties without external assistance. This version bore, by 1991, almost no resemblance to the truth. And Diana, who had been formed by her earliest experience into a person for whom the gap between official version and lived reality was a source of almost physical discomfort, had reached the limit of what she could sustain. Andrew Morton was a royal journalist, not a member of the inner circle of palace correspondents who maintained the carefully negotiated access agreements that governed most royal reporting, but a writer who had made his name through an approach to royal biography that placed a higher premium on truth than on the continued goodwill of the institution. He had begun researching a book about Diana, and through the network of connections that surrounds any prominent public figure, the possibility of her cooperation had been raised. The mechanism by which their collaboration was arranged was, in itself, a measure of the seriousness of what was happening. Diana did not meet Morton directly, not initially, and not for the most significant portions of the collaboration. Instead, through an intermediary, her friend James Colthurst, who acted as courier between them, she received Morton's questions, and she answered them in the privacy of her sitting room at Kensington Palace, speaking into a tape recorder, alone except for her own voice and the knowledge of what she was doing. The tapes? The significance of the tapes, both as historical document and as personal act, can hardly be overstated. They were made in secret, in stolen hours, in the spaces between the official schedule and the domestic life, in the rooms of a palace that was also in its way a kind of prison. She sat with the recorder and she answered the questions and she told the truth, not a partial truth, not the diplomatically hedged version that the official world had been receiving from her for a decade, but the full, unguarded, painful truth, in the specific and particular way that Diana told things when she was genuinely telling them. With specificity. With feeling. With the kind of detail that could only be provided by someone who had lived the experience, and retained it with the complete, and sometimes agonizing fidelity of a very sensitive memory. She spoke about her unhappiness in the marriage. She spoke about the eating disorder, describing it in terms so direct and so vivid that those who later read or heard the transcripts found it difficult to believe that anyone who had been close to her during those years could have failed to understand the severity of what she was experiencing. She spoke about Camilla, about the knowledge and the pain of the knowledge, and the particular devastation of discovering that the relationship had not ended at the wedding and had not ended subsequently, and was not, as far as she could determine, going to end at all. She spoke about the palace's response to her difficulties, about the inadequacy of the support she had received, about the loneliness that had no official name within the institution, because the institution had no framework for acknowledging that someone in her position might be lonely in ways that required acknowledgement and care. She spoke about her self-harm. This is the detail that the later accounts of these tapes returned to most frequently, because it was the most unexpected and, in the context of the public image she had maintained, the most startling disclosure. She described specific incidents, occasions when the pain she was living with had become temporarily more than she could contain internally, and had found its expression in physical acts of self-injury. She described these incidents without self-pity and without dramatization, in the manner of someone reporting something that had happened to them as honestly as they could, not to generate sympathy but to tell the truth. The courage of this disclosure, sitting alone in a room with a tape recorder, and saying out loud the things that she had not been able to say to the people around her, that the people around her had not been equipped to hear, is difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of the present. We inhabit now a world in which the conversation about mental health has been substantially reframed, in which the disclosure of psychological suffering is not universally welcomed but is at least understood to be legitimate, to be a subject that people have the right to discuss and seek help for. In 1991, in the specific context of the royal family and the public world that surrounded it, the disclosure Diana made on those tapes was not merely personally costly, it was institutionally revolutionary. It was a member of the royal family saying, in explicit and unambiguous terms, that the institution had failed her, that the requirements of the role had caused her genuine and serious harm, and that the official version of her life was a fiction. She made 6 hours of tape. 6 hours of speaking alone into a recorder in a palace sitting room, building session by session, the record of a life that the world had been seeing only from the outside. The tapes were carried by James Colthurst to Morton, transcribed, formed the basis of a manuscript. The process was slow and careful, and conducted with a secrecy that was essential to its continuation. Had the palace known what was being assembled, the mechanisms of institutional management would certainly have been brought to bear, and the tapes and the book and the truth they contained might never have reached the world. What was happening inside her during the months of this secret project is something that the tapes themselves, and her later accounts, partially illuminate. She was frightened of the consequences, of the magnitude of what she was doing, of the ways in which the disclosure would permanently alter her relationship with the institution she had joined and the family she had married into. She was also, she said, relieved, with the particular relief of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long and has finally been given permission by themselves and by the existence of someone willing to listen to put it down. The recording sessions became, in their way, a form of therapy, not a substitute for the professional support she was also receiving, but a parallel process, a sustained act of witnessing her own experience, of finding words for things that had existed until now only as feeling. She was articulate on the tapes in ways that surprised Morton, and that surprised in retrospect those who had underestimated her intelligence. She was precise about dates and incidents and emotional textures. She was funny occasionally, the dark, self-aware humor that was one of her most consistent qualities surfacing even in the most painful passages, punctuating the testimony with a lightness that made the darkness more rather than less visible. She was also, during the months of the Morton collaboration, living the daily life of the Princess of Wales with the same professional consistency that had characterized every other period of her existence. She attended engagements. She appeared with Charles at official functions. She was photographed and written about and speculated over in the manner that had become simply the condition of her public existence. The gap between the woman speaking into the tape recorder in the Kensington Palace sitting room and the woman smiling at the cameras outside the Royal Opera House was, during these months, wider than it had ever been. A gap so wide that it constituted a kind of doubling. A coexistence of selves so distinct from each other that sustaining them simultaneously required an effort of will that those who managed her schedule and read the press reports of her public appearances were not positioned to detect. The children were her anchor during this period, as they were always her anchor. William was 9 years old in 1991, moving through the early years of his education at Ludgrove School with the particular quiet resilience of a child who has understood without being explicitly told that certain things in his family are not straightforward. He was perceptive, he had her perceptiveness, among other things, and there were moments when Diana saw in his expression something that told her he knew more than he was saying, that he was carrying in the way of children who love their parents and cannot protect them, something of the weight of the situation. She tried to protect him from it, and she was not always able to, and this failure, the failure to insulate her children fully from the consequences of a marriage that was failing, was the one that cost her most. Harry, at 6 and 7, was still largely in the sunlit world of early childhood, energetic, uncomplicated, demanding in the straightforward way of a small boy who wants what he wants and is not yet old enough to have fully developed the art of restraint. He made her laugh. He always made her laugh, with the particular wholehearted laughter that belongs to people who find genuine pleasure in the company of someone exuberantly alive, and the laughter was necessary, was, in those difficult months, among the most necessary things available to her. The state of the marriage in 1991 and into 1992 was a state of formal coexistence, two people sharing the structure of a life without sharing its substance, maintaining the outward form of a functioning royal partnership while privately inhabiting something very different. They communicated through staff, largely. They appeared together at official engagements with the professional competence that both of them were entirely capable of bringing to the task. And the photographs taken at these events, the smiles, the careful positioning, the body language of a couple at ease, told a story that the reality behind them did not support. Those who worked closely with them during this period were aware, to varying degrees, of the extent of the distance. The household staff, who live at closer quarters to the reality of a domestic situation than almost any external observer, knew things that the official record did not acknowledge. Some of them were loyal to Diana, and some were loyal to Charles, and the divisions within the household mirrored and reinforced the divisions within the marriage, so that Kensington Palace in these years had the atmosphere of a place in which two separate and increasingly irreconcilable versions of the truth were in quiet, continuous competition. The Morton book was not in these months the only symptom of the marriage's condition becoming visible to the outside world. The press had been speculating about the state of the royal marriage for years, with varying degrees of accuracy and varying degrees of concern for the welfare of the people being speculated about. And by 1991 and 1992, the speculation was acquiring a specificity that suggested sources close to the situation. There were stories about the couple's separate schedules, their separate friendship groups, the absence of the domestic togetherness that a functioning marriage was understood to require. There were photographs, taken at public events by photographers skilled at reading body language, that showed to those willing to look, two people who were not comfortable in each other's company. Charles, for his part, was also no longer entirely silent. He too had people around him who understood the value of the press, who understood that the narrative of the marriage was being told, and that the question of who told it and how would matter enormously for what came after. The years between 1991 and 1992 were years in which both sides of the marriage were, without the explicit acknowledgement of either, beginning to prepare the ground for a future that no longer contained the other. The palace was aware that something was coming. The institution has its own intelligence systems, the networks of connection and communication that allow a large and complex organization to monitor threats to its stability. And by the early months of 1992, the intelligence was suggesting that a significant disclosure was imminent. The precise nature of that disclosure and its provenance was not yet clear. But the atmosphere within the institution had acquired the particular quality of tension that precedes events, whose shape is not yet known, but whose weight can already be felt. In June of 1992, Andrew Morton's book was published. Its full title was Diana, Her True Story, and the title was not false advertising. It was, in the context of royal biography and the carefully maintained conventions of royal communication, an extraordinary document, a first-person account told in the subject's own words through extensive quotation from the material she had provided, of the interior reality of one of the most scrutinized marriages in the world. It described in specific and unflinching terms the eating disorder, the self-harm, the depression, the isolation, the presence of Camilla, the inadequacy of institutional support, the loneliness of a life lived inside a beautiful and terrible fiction. The reaction was immediate and enormous. The newspapers that had been writing about Diana for a decade found themselves confronted with a story that exceeded anything they had previously managed. Not because it was more dramatic in a tabloid sense, though it was certainly dramatic, but because it was true, and because the truth it contained was simultaneously familiar and shocking, recognizable and unexpected, the confirmation of suspicions long held and the revelation of realities not previously guessed at. The palace's initial response was denial, the institutional reflex of an organization confronted with a narrative that threatens its preferred account of itself. The denials were issued through the official channels, with the authority of establishment voices, and the confidence of people who have previously found that establishment authority is a reliable tool for managing inconvenient stories. But this story was different, and the tools that worked for smaller inconveniences were not going to work for this one. The detail of the tapes was too specific. The emotional truth of the account was too vivid, too particular, too clearly derived from primary experience to be dismissed as invention or misrepresentation. Diana did not publicly confirm her participation at the time of the book's publication. She could not. The legal and institutional consequences of such a confirmation were, in 1992, too significant and too immediate for a straightforward acknowledgement. But she did not deny it either, with the definitiveness that the palace's response required. She was evasive in a way that was itself communicative, evasive with the specific quality of someone who is protecting a truth rather than concealing a lie. The public response to the book was, in one dimension, simply the latest expression of the enormous love that the world had been directing at Diana for a decade. People bought the book in extraordinary numbers. They read it, and they recognized in it the woman they thought they knew, recognized her in ways that the official version of her life had never allowed, because the official version had given them the surface and the book was giving them the interior, and the interior turned out to be more coherent and more comprehensible and more fully human than the official version had had space to accommodate. But the public response was also something more complex than sympathy. It was the beginning of a process of collective re-evaluation, a rethinking, happening simultaneously in millions of households and conversations and private reflections, of what the marriage of Charles and Diana had actually been, of what the royal family's conduct had actually involved, of what had been done to this young woman who had walked into St. Paul's Cathedral on a summer morning 11 years before and given the world something that the world had not known it needed until she gave it. The anger that accompanied the sympathy was real, and it was directed, with the imprecision of collective emotion but the force of genuine moral response, toward the institution that had failed her. This was new. The British public's relationship with the monarchy has always been complicated, a mixture of affection, respect, mild exasperation, and the particular emotional investment that comes from an institution that has been woven into the national narrative for centuries. But the Morton book introduced into that relationship a new and uncomfortable element, the possibility that the institution had not merely been imperfect in the management of its affairs, but had been actively complicit in the suffering of someone it had a duty to protect. The official separation of Charles and Diana was announced on the 9th of December, 1992, by the Prime Minister John Major in the House of Commons. The announcement was made there, rather than by the palace directly, as a constitutional courtesy, the Prime Minister informing Parliament of a development in the circumstances of the heir to the throne. Major read the statement in the measured tones of a man delivering news whose significance he understood, and whose difficulty he was managing with the tools available to him. He noted that the separation was amicable, that there were no plans for divorce, that the constitutional position of the Princess of Wales was unaffected, that both the Prince and Princess would continue to carry out their public duties. The statement was careful and accurate and entirely beside the point, in the way that official statements about human situations frequently are. It addressed the constitutional dimensions with precision and the human dimensions not at all, which was perhaps inevitable but which produced in those who heard it a particular kind of dissatisfaction. The dissatisfaction of a public that had been told the administrative facts of a situation whose emotional reality it had just spent 6 months absorbing through the pages of a book that those administrative facts could not begin to address. Diana heard the announcement. She was at Kensington Palace, and the statement was read to her before it was made public as protocol required. A formal notification, delivered through the appropriate channels, of the official end of a marriage that had been in its practical dimensions over for considerably longer. She received it with the composure that she was always capable of marshalling for the moments that required it, and the composure was real in its way, because she had known this was coming, and had, over the months of the Morton collaboration and the aftermath of its publication, done the internal work of preparing for it. But composure is not the same as peace, and the announcement that the marriage was formally over carried with it a weight that preparation could not entirely absorb. It was the end of something she had wanted to work, had tried to make work, had remained committed to long after the evidence had ceased to support the commitment. It was also, she understood with the clarity of someone who has been thinking carefully about her own situation for a very long time, a beginning. The question of what she was going to do with the life she now had, the life that was no longer organized around the maintenance of a marriage or the performance of a role that the marriage had defined, was a question she had been approaching for years and was now, with the December announcement, actually required to answer. She was 31 years old. Her sons were 10 and 8. The book that had broken the official silence was in millions of homes around the world. The institution she had joined at 19 was now, in some formal and irreversible sense, no longer her home. She stood at the window of Kensington Palace and looked out at the December garden, bare in the winter light. And the knowledge of what had ended and what had not yet begun settled around her with the particular weight of things that are true and cannot be untrue. The tapes were in a safe place. The truth was in the world. The rest was going to have to be built from here. The War of the Windsors, 1992 to 1995. There are wars that are fought with armies and declared with the formality of ultimatums, and there are wars that are fought with words and conducted through proxies, in the columns of newspapers and the carefully managed disclosures of competing press offices and the precisely calibrated interviews of people who have decided that the time for silence is over. The second kind of war is quieter than the first and in certain respects more ruthless, because the weapons it employs are made of truth, or of versions of truth, and truth, once released into the world, cannot be recalled or surrendered or exchanged for a peace treaty. It simply continues, doing its work, reshaping the landscape it moves through in ways that no one who deployed it can entirely control. The war between Charles and Diana, between their competing narratives, their separate truths, their irreconcilable accounts of what their marriage had been and what the institution had done and failed to do, began in earnest in the years following the separation. It did not begin with the declaration of hostilities. It began, as such wars do, with the gradual hardening of positions, the consolidation of allies, the quiet recognition on both sides that the version of events that prevailed in the public mind would determine not merely the emotional legacy of the marriage, but the practical future of both parties, their relationship with their children, their standing within the institution, their ability to define themselves in the years ahead. The Morton book had fired the first significant shot, though Diana had not been able at the time to acknowledge her role in its firing. By the time the separation was announced in December of 1992, the book had been in the world for 6 months, had sold in numbers that astonished even its publishers, had reshaped the public understanding of the marriage in ways that the palace's official responses had been entirely unable to reverse. The narrative advantage, in the winter of 1992, was Diana's, not because she had set out to gain an advantage, or because her motivations in speaking to Morton had been primarily strategic, but because the truth she had told was more compelling and more sympathetic than the official version it had displaced, and the public had received it as such. Charles's camp understood this. The people around him, his advisors, his friends, the journalists and commentators who were sympathetic to his position, understood that the public narrative had shifted in Diana's favor, and that if it was not addressed, the shift would become permanent. They also understood something that the Morton book had not fully addressed, that Charles had a story too, a version of the marriage and its difficulties that was different from Diana's, and that was not without its own legitimacy, and that there was an audience for that story if the right vehicle could be found to deliver it. The vehicle they found was Jonathan Dimbleby. Dimbleby was a journalist of considerable stature and seriousness, a man whose credentials were impeccable, and whose association with the project would lend it a gravity that a more obviously partisan outlet could not have provided. He was commissioned to write an authorized biography of Charles, and as part of that project, Charles agreed to be interviewed on camera. A lengthy, detailed personal interview, the kind of interview that a man in his position almost never gives, precisely because the risks of the personal register are so much greater than the risks of the official one. The Dimbleby documentary, broadcast on ITV on the 29th of June 1994, was a television event of considerable significance. It ran for nearly 2.5 hours. It showed Charles in a variety of settings, at Highgrove in his garden in conversation with Dimbleby about his childhood, his marriage, his values, his vision for the monarchy. He spoke about his relationship with his parents with a candor that was, for a royal figure, genuinely unusual, acknowledging the emotional distance of his upbringing, the absence of the warmth and demonstrative affection that he had needed and had not always received, the loneliness of a childhood spent under the particular pressures of hereditary position. He was sympathetic in these passages, and he intended to be sympathetic, and he was, because the loneliness he described was real, and the absence of warmth he spoke about was real, and the public, which had spent years observing the man without fully understanding him, received this self-disclosure with something more complicated than it had expected to feel. And then Dimbleby asked him about Camilla. The question was direct. Had he been faithful to Diana throughout the marriage? Charles paused, that pause, familiar to anyone who has subsequently watched the interview, which carries within it the knowledge of what is coming and the weight of a decision already made, a decision to tell the truth regardless of the consequences. And then he said no. He had not been faithful throughout the marriage. He had resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. After the marriage had irretrievably broken down, he added, a qualification that was both legally and emotionally significant and that satisfied almost no one. The confession detonated across the British media with a force that surprised even those who had anticipated it. It was not the content precisely that surprised. The relationship with Camilla had been speculated about and reported on for years, and the Morton book had addressed it directly. What surprised was the confirmation, the public explicit first-person acknowledgement by the Prince of Wales that he had been unfaithful to his wife. This was territory that no heir to the British throne had previously occupied in living memory, at least not in the full light of a primetime television interview, and the combination of the content and the setting produced a moment of collective disorientation, a sense that something had shifted in the relationship between the monarchy and the public that could not be shifted back. The qualification about the marriage having irretrievably broken down before the affair resumed was for Diana both the detail she focused on and the detail she found most painful. She had heard him say it, she watched the documentary, as did millions of others, and what she heard in that qualifying clause was the transfer of responsibility, the implication that the breakdown of the marriage was a precondition that absolved what followed. She did not accept that framing. She had her own account of the timeline, her own understanding of when the marriage had broken down and why, and the distance between his version and hers was itself a measure of how completely they had inhabited different marriages, or rather how completely their experience of the same marriage had diverged. She said, publicly, very little about the documentary in the immediate aftermath. This was consistent with her approach during this period. She was learning in these years between the separation and the Panorama interview the value of timing, the strategic importance of choosing the moment rather than responding to every provocation as it arose. The instinct to respond was always there. She was not by temperament a woman who found silence easy when something important was being said about her, but she was becoming, in the crucible of the post-separation years, considerably more sophisticated about the difference between the impulse to speak and the wisdom of speaking. Her life in the immediate aftermath of the separation had acquired a new shape, not entirely comfortable in its newness, not yet fully formed, but distinctly hers in a way that the life of the marriage had not been. She remained at Kensington Palace, which was officially her residence and practically her home in the only meaningful sense of the word, the place where her sons lived when they were not at school, where her life had its center of gravity. She continued her charitable work with an energy and a focus that had not diminished with the change in her official status. She appeared at public engagements. She was photographed and written about and speculated over with the same intensity that had characterized every phase of her public existence. But there were significant changes. The formal apparatus of royal support, the staff and the infrastructure and the institutional backing that had been part of her life as Princess of Wales, was being gradually withdrawn. This process was managed carefully by the palace, with the bureaucratic precision of an institution that understands the importance of appearing to act fairly while acting in its own interests. Offices were reduced. Staff were reassigned. The mechanisms by which she had conducted her official life, the private office, the press operation, the logistical support, were trimmed in ways that were presented as administrative adjustments, but that constituted, in their cumulative effect, a significant reduction in her institutional standing. She also lost her HRH designation in the divorce settlement that was finalized in 1996, but the preconditions for that loss were being established in the years that preceded it, in the gradual redrawing of the boundaries of her official role, in the removal of the institutional backing that had defined her position, in the subtle but persistent signals from within the palace that the institution was recalibrating its relationship with her in ways that she had not been consulted about and could not entirely prevent. She was not without resources. She was never without resources, because the resource she possessed that no institutional withdrawal could reach was herself, her presence, her warmth, her ability to generate in the people she encountered a quality of connection that was entirely independent of title or official status. She was Diana, with or without the HRH. The world knew this. The world demonstrated it at every public appearance, at every charity visit, at every moment when the cameras found her and she looked up with that particular expression, the slight downward cast, the upward meeting of the eyes, the smile that contained simultaneously the awareness of being watched and the refusal to be diminished by it. The children were moving through these years with the particular grace and difficulty of boys who are old enough to understand, in broad outline, what is happening to their family, and young enough to have no framework for managing what that understanding costs them. William was 11, 12, 13 in these years, the difficult years of early adolescence, when the ordinary turbulence of growing up is complicated in his case by the extraordinary turbulence of a family situation that was being conducted, in significant part, in the pages of the world's newspapers. He was at Eton by 1995, in the contained and traditional world of one of England's oldest schools, where the protocols of privacy were sufficiently robust to provide some buffer against the chaos of the public narrative. Harry was younger, more protected by his age, more able to inhabit the immediate world of childhood without the complications that William's greater maturity and greater sensitivity to the situation imposed on him. Diana was fiercely present for both of them, as fiercely present as the logistics of a life that was simultaneously more free and more difficult than it had been during the marriage allowed her to be. She rang them at school. She collected them personally, where this was possible. She planned the holidays with a care and a specificity that those who helped her organize them found touching, choosing destinations and activities with William and Harry's preferences at the center of every decision, refusing to allow the logistics of her own complicated life to subordinate their experience. The years between the separation and the Panorama interview were also years of personal reconstruction, of the slow, difficult, sometimes exhilarating work of reassembling a self that had been, for more than a decade, significantly defined by its relationship to an institution and a marriage that had both, in their different ways, required the subordination of certain essential aspects of who she was. She was working with therapists. She was exploring, with the particular earnestness of someone who has come through significant suffering and is trying to understand what it means, ideas about spiritual practice and psychological health, and the relationship between the interior life and the exterior world. She was reading. She was talking to her friends, to the advisors and helpers who had gathered around her in the post-separation years, to the people she trusted with the ongoing project of her own becoming. She was also, in this period, navigating the complicated terrain of her own romantic life with the cautiousness and the occasional impulsiveness of someone who is both desperate for love and profoundly wary of its costs. There were relationships, some of them reported on with a prurience that bore no relationship to the human reality of what they actually were, some of them significant enough in her interior life to have left genuine traces in her account of these years. She was a woman in her early 30s who had been formed by one enormous and enormously painful intimate relationship and was trying to discover in the aftermath of its formal end what she was capable of in love, what she needed, what she was willing to risk. The specific relationships of these years are not this story's primary concern. They belong to the category of private experience that even the most public life is entitled to retain. What matters, for the understanding of where she was and where she was going, is the quality of the searching they represent. She was not, this needs to be said plainly, a woman who had accepted that the marriage and its ending defined the limits of what was available to her. She was a woman who wanted to love and to be loved, with the full and uncomplicated wholeness that the marriage had not managed to provide, and who was willing to bear the costs and risks of that wanting rather than retreat into the safety of its absence. Through 1994 and into 1995, as the Dimbleby documentary settled into the public consciousness and its implications continued to reverberate, Diana was preparing. The word is not too strong. She was engaged in a preparation that was both practical and psychological, a readying of herself for something she had decided to do and was not going to be dissuaded from doing. She had watched the Dimbleby documentary. She had watched Charles speak about the marriage, about Camilla, about the breakdown of their relationship, and she had listened to the framing, and she had found the framing inadequate to her experience, inadequate to the truth, inadequate to the public's right to understand what had actually happened. She approached the BBC journalist Martin Bashir. The specific mechanics of how this approach was made, whether Bashir came to her first or she came to him, and through what intermediaries, would later become the subject of significant controversy that extended well beyond the interview itself, controversy that would attach itself to Bashir's conduct and to the BBC's subsequent handling of the situation, and that would cast a retrospective shadow over an event that was in itself one of the most significant hours of television in the history of British broadcasting. What is not in dispute is the interview itself, and what Diana said in it. The Panorama interview was recorded on the 5th of November 1995, in the sitting room at Kensington Palace, without the knowledge of the palace, without the knowledge of Charles, and in the company only of Bashir, a camera operator, and the specific quality of contained resolve that Diana brought to situations she had decided to meet on her own terms. It was broadcast on the 20th of November 1995, and it was watched by 23 million people in the United Kingdom alone, an audience that constituted one of the largest in the history of British television. An audience assembled not by the promise of entertainment, but by the need to witness something that everyone understood before it began was going to matter. She had dressed carefully. This was always significant with Diana. The clothes were never merely clothes, never simply the practical solution to the problem of what to wear. She wore a black suit with a cream blouse, understated by her public standards, the palette chosen to communicate seriousness rather than glamour. Her hair was shorter than it had been in the early years, the cut more decisive. Her makeup was deliberately minimal. She wanted to be seen in this interview, not as the Princess of Wales in her official aspect, not as the woman who arrived at state banquets in Catherine Walker gowns with her hair immaculate and her jewels ancestral, but as a person. A woman. Someone whose face, unguarded, could be trusted to tell the truth. She looked into the camera in the way that she had always been uniquely capable of looking into cameras, directly, without deflection, with the quality of contact that most people cannot sustain with an inanimate lens, and that Diana achieved as naturally as breathing. And she spoke. She spoke about the marriage. She spoke about Camilla with a directness that left no room for the diplomatic ambiguity that official statements had previously maintained. There were 3 people in this marriage, she said, and it was a bit crowded, and the words became immediately and permanently lodged in the language, because they were true in the specific way that very simple statements of very complicated truths are true, compressing an enormous amount of pain and experience and understanding into a formulation so economical that it could not be improved upon. She said it without self-pity and without the performance of bitterness that the situation might have licensed. And the absence of bitterness was itself a kind of eloquence. She spoke about her own failings. This was the part of the interview that the more reductive subsequent accounts tend to underweight, because it was the part that complicated the simpler narrative, the narrative in which she was straightforwardly the wronged party, and he was straightforwardly the villain. She acknowledged that she had not always been easy to live with. She acknowledged the eating disorder, which she had disclosed privately in the Morton material, and was now disclosing publicly in her own face and her own voice to 23 million people. She acknowledged the self-harm. She acknowledged the ways in which her own difficulties had contributed to the difficulties of the marriage. She was not, in these acknowledgments, distributing blame evenly or suggesting that her conduct and Charles's were morally equivalent. They were not, and she knew it. She was being honest in the specific way of someone who understands that the most persuasive truth is the one that does not exempt the teller from its scope. She spoke about the monarchy and her vision of her own role within it. This was the passage that generated the most sustained institutional anxiety. Her statement that she would like to be a queen in people's hearts, that she did not see herself fitting into the system, that the system had determined to reject her, and that she had in some sense accepted the determination. She was not, in saying these things, attacking the monarchy as an institution. She believed in the monarchy, she had said so before and would say so again, and the belief was genuine, rooted in her understanding of what the crown represented in the life of the country, and in the particular quality of her own relationship with the public that the crown had given her access to. What she was doing was something more specific and more radical. She was declining to accept the institution's assessment of itself, declining to treat its internal judgments about who belonged and who did not as the final word. She spoke about Charles's suitability for kingship, and here the interview acquired its most controversial passage. Bashir asked her whether she thought the Prince of Wales would be king. She paused, and in the pause lived a very great deal of history, and then she said that she believed Charles would find the top job. The specific phrase she used, would find it very constraining. The implication was clear. The words were measured. The damage they did to the relationship between herself and the institution, and between herself and Charles, was considerable, because what she was suggesting, with her characteristic combination of apparent mildness and actual precision, was that the man who was heir to the throne was not temperamentally suited to occupy it. The Queen's response to the Panorama interview was swift and characteristically decisive. Within weeks of its broadcast, she wrote to both Charles and Diana advising them, a word that coming from the sovereign carries the weight of instruction, that they should proceed with the divorce without further delay. The letter was private, but its existence and its content became known, because in the post-Morton, post-Panorama world that Diana had done so much to create, the age of royal privacy had effectively ended, and information that would previously have remained within the family moved with increasing inevitability outward into the world. The divorce proceedings were initiated, and they would be finalized in August of 1996. But the announcement of the divorce, and the proceedings leading to it, belonged to a period that was less a story of the war itself than of its aftermath, the clearing of the battlefield, the counting of what had been lost, the beginning of the separate futures that the war had been in its deepest logic about securing. The War of the Windsors had been, beneath its specific grievances and its particular artillery, a war about narrative, about who had the right to tell the story of the marriage, to define its meaning, to determine how the people within it would be understood by the world they had inhabited so publicly for so long. Diana had entered the war with fewer resources than she ended it with. She had entered it without the institutional backing, the official communications infrastructure, the establishment authority that Charles and the palace could deploy. She had entered it with herself, her voice, her face, her extraordinary ability to communicate directly with the people who were watching, to cross the distance between a television screen and a living room with the same quality of personal contact she brought to every room she entered in person. She had by most meaningful measures won. Not cleanly, not without cost, not in a way that resolved the questions it had raised or secured everything she had hoped for. But the narrative, the story of what the marriage had been and what she had experienced within it, was hers. The world had heard her, with the full force of its attention, and the world had believed her. And in the particular war she had been fighting, that was the only victory that mattered. She sat in the Kensington Palace sitting room after the broadcast, in the quiet that follows the ending of something enormously significant, and the 23 million people who had been watching returned to their own evenings, and the institution began its process of response, and the newspaper editors assembled the front pages that would greet the morning. She was 34 years old. She had told the truth at last, in a room with cameras, to the world. What came next was not the end of anything. It was, in ways she could not yet fully see, the beginning of the part of her life that was most fully and most freely hers, and the most dangerous, because freedom, for a woman in her position in the world she inhabited, had costs that safety did not. The morning came. The papers landed on the doorsteps. The world read what she had said. And nothing after that was quite the same. Redefining the Crown, 1995 to 1997. There are moments in a life when everything that was once certain begins to fall away, not all at once but slowly, like the last pages of a book turning without warning. For Diana, Princess of Wales, the years between 1995 and 1997 were exactly that kind of unraveling. And yet, paradoxically, they were also the years in which she became most entirely herself. By the close of 1994, the marriage between Diana and Prince Charles had long since ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. It was a formal arrangement held together by protocol and silence, a ghost of a union that haunted Kensington Palace like a cold draft through old stone walls. Both parties had spoken publicly of their pain. Charles in his 1994 documentary with Jonathan Dimbleby, where he had admitted to his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, Diana in whispered conversations and careful gestures that the world had learned to read. But what came next would shatter the remaining illusions entirely. It was the autumn of 1995. Diana had made a decision, one that was deliberate, considered, and deeply brave. She would speak. Not through intermediaries, not through carefully placed newspaper stories or anonymous sources, but directly on camera to the British public. She had agreed to an interview with Martin Bashir of the BBC's Panorama program. And on the evening of November the 20th, while Prince Charles was attending a function in Germany and Buckingham Palace had been given no forewarning whatsoever, the interview aired. 23 million people in Britain alone sat down to watch. The room in which Diana sat was modest by royal standards, a small, intimate space with soft, warm light. She wore a fitted black jacket, and her eyes, those extraordinary blue-gray eyes that had always seemed to speak before her lips did, were lined darkly, giving her a depth of expression that the camera could not help but seek. She looked, to those watching, like a woman who had decided to stop being afraid. She spoke carefully, choosing each word as though weighing it on a scale. She spoke of loneliness. Of feeling entirely alone within the institution she had married into at 20 years old. She spoke of bulimia, of self-harm, of the helplessness she had felt when the machinery of the palace had turned its attention away from her suffering and toward the management of its own image. She said that when she had cried for help, the people around her had not known what to do, and so they had done nothing. She said that she had tried to take her own life on more than one occasion. She said these things not with bitterness, but with a kind of measured sorrow, as though she had spent years rehearsing how to speak about pain without becoming consumed by it. And then came the moment the world would never forget. Martin Bashir asked her about her own infidelity, about James Hewitt, the cavalry officer with whom she had maintained a relationship during the years when her marriage had already privately collapsed. Diana did not flinch. She admitted it. She looked directly into the camera and said yes. She had loved him. And the honesty of it, the sheer, audacious honesty, moved something in the public that no carefully managed royal statement ever could. She was asked whether she believed Charles should become king. She paused. She said she hoped he would find the peace he was looking for. She said she believed the monarchy needed to adapt, that it needed to be closer to the people. And then, in a phrase that would echo through the decades that followed, she said, "I would like to be a queen in people's hearts." It was not a political statement. It was something far more powerful. It was a declaration of a different kind of royalty, one not inherited through bloodline or confirmed by ceremony, but earned through presence, through feeling, through the willingness to sit in a chair on national television and say, "I am a human being and I have suffered and I am still here." The palace was furious. Courtiers described the interview as a catastrophic act of self-sabotage. Senior advisors spoke of betrayal. The tabloid press, always eager to determine whose side it was on in any given week, split sharply. But among the public, particularly women, particularly those who had ever felt invisible within the systems that were supposed to care for them, the reaction was something closer to reverence. Diana had done the unthinkable. She had stepped outside the institution that defined her and looked back at it clearly, without blinking. The consequences were swift. In December of 1995, 6 weeks after the Panorama broadcast, Queen Elizabeth II took the highly unusual step of writing directly to both Charles and Diana to request that they proceed with a formal divorce without further delay. The letter was understood not as an invitation, but as a command. The monarchy, which had endured so much damage in recent years, the separation of Charles and Diana in 1992, the devastating Windsor Castle fire that same year, the relentless tabloid exposure of the private lives of nearly every senior royal, could not sustain this level of public conflict at the heart of the family. Something had to end. Negotiations began. They were, by all accounts, extraordinarily difficult. The question of money was complex. The question of the children was fraught with emotion. But the question that cut deepest, the question that Diana fought with everything she had, was the question of her title. She was to lose the prefix Her Royal Highness. She would no longer be styled as a Royal Highness. She would remain Diana, Princess of Wales, but stripped of the formal rank that entitled her to a curtsy from every member of the royal family, including eventually her own sons. It was an act of institutional severance, precise, deliberate, and wounding. To remove the HRH was to say, "You are no longer entirely one of us. You exist outside the structure. You are adjacent to the crown, but not part of it." Diana understood exactly what it meant. She had spent 15 years inside that structure, had given it 2 heirs, had smiled on 10,000 balconies and shaken 100,000 hands and worn the jewels and said the right words and dressed the right way, and now it was telling her that she had never quite belonged. That the titles and the palaces and the protocol had always been on loan. She wept. Those close to her during this period describe a woman cycling between extraordinary strength and profound grief. There were days when she was focused, purposeful, energized, already thinking about what her life might look like outside the confines of the royal machine. And there were other days when the loss of who she had been, or who she had been told she was, pressed down on her like weather. The divorce was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. Diana, Princess of Wales, was no longer a member of the royal family in the formal constitutional sense. She was, in the eyes of the palace, a private individual. The settlement was substantial. She received a lump sum reported to be approximately £17 million, the use of her apartments at Kensington Palace, and shared custody of William and Harry. She retained her place in the public imagination. She retained her name. She retained the devotion of hundreds of millions of people around the world. And she retained, perhaps most importantly, her freedom. She had no staff dictating which charities she could support. No courtiers reviewing her schedule for political sensitivities. No institution second-guessing her choices. For the first time in her adult life, Diana could simply decide where to go, what to do, who to be. She had already begun to find the answer. In January of 1997, Diana traveled to Angola. Not on a royal tour, not as part of an official diplomatic mission, but as a private individual aligned with the Halo Trust, a humanitarian organization dedicated to the removal of landmines from post-conflict zones. Angola had been devastated by a decades-long civil war, and the landscape was littered, quite literally, with the remnants of it. Mines buried in red earth. Paths that looked safe and were not. Villages where children had grown up knowing to watch where they placed their feet. Diana wore a white hard hat and a protective visor. She wore a flak jacket over a pale blue shirt. She walked through active minefields. She held the hands of survivors, men and women and children who had lost limbs to devices buried beneath the ground, invisible and patient and merciless. She sat beside them. She looked at their wounds, not with the polished, careful compassion of a ceremonial visit, but with the undivided attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand what had happened to them and why. The photographs from Angola went around the world within hours. There was one image in particular, Diana walking alone through a narrow corridor of cleared ground, the red earth stretching out on either side, warning signs visible in the background. She is looking ahead, her expression calm and serious and entirely unperformed. She is not smiling for cameras. She is simply there. Present. Moving through a place of danger, with the steady pace of someone who has weighed the risk and decided the cause is worth it. Politicians were uncomfortable. Some in government suggested that Diana was, as a private citizen, involving herself in matters of foreign policy that were not her concern. There were those who argued that the landmine debate was politically contentious, that it touched on questions of international defense strategy and arms production, and that Diana's presence gave it a kind of emotional weight that was difficult to counter with rational argument. This, of course, was precisely the point. Diana understood something that career politicians frequently underestimate. She understood that policy changes when hearts change. She understood that statistics and reports and United Nations briefing documents do not move people in the way that a face does. In the way that a child's face does. The face of a child sitting in a hospital bed without a leg, holding the hand of a woman who was once a princess and has come a very long way to sit beside them. She continued to speak about landmines publicly. She gave interviews. She wrote. She used every platform available to her. And she used it with the confidence of someone who has decided that caring about a cause more than about her own image is not a weakness, but a form of power. In the months following the Angola trip, she also traveled to Bosnia, another country still stitched with the wounds of recent war, another landscape where mines waited beneath the surface of ordinary ground. The pattern was deliberate. She was building something. She was constructing a public role that belonged entirely to her, not to the palace, not to the monarchy, not to any institution, a role defined by compassion translated into action. Back in London, her private life was evolving too. The divorce had freed her from the formal constraints of royal life, but it had not relieved her from the weight of public scrutiny. The press followed her still, perhaps more intensely than before if such a thing were possible. Every restaurant she entered, every friend she visited, every journey she made was documented by the long lenses of photographers who waited outside Kensington Palace, the way one waits for a train, reliably, without question, as a matter of professional routine. She had attempted relationships. There had been Oliver Hoare, the art dealer, a relationship conducted in great secrecy and ultimately made public. There had been Hasnat Khan, the Pakistani-British cardiac surgeon she had met in 1995, a man described by those who knew them together as someone Diana had genuinely and deeply loved. Khan was private where she was public, reserved where she was instinctive. He disliked the attention that came with proximity to her, and found the constant surveillance of their relationship, the photographers outside his hospital, the tabloid speculation about their future, to be an intrusion into a life he had not chosen to share with the world. By 1997, that relationship too had ended. She was searching. That much was evident. Not restlessly, not chaotically, but with the particular searching quality of a person who has shed one version of themselves and is feeling their way toward the next. She was 45 by the summer of 1997. There was time. There was an entire life ahead of her, and she knew it, and she was beginning to shape it deliberately. She redesigned her wardrobe. This may seem a small detail, a footnote to larger events, but for Diana, fashion had always been a form of language. In the years following the divorce, her aesthetic choices became bolder and more personal. She had always been stylish, but her style had once been calibrated to suit the institution: demure hemlines, structured suits, the visual grammar of respectable royalty. Now she wore figure-skimming slip dresses, sleeveless column gowns, simpler silhouettes that looked more like the clothes of a contemporary woman than the ceremonial wardrobe of a royal consort. She cut her hair shorter. She looked, and this word is used advisedly, free. In June of 1997, she organized an auction at Christie's in New York. 79 of her dresses, each one worn to a significant public event, each one carrying within its fabric a particular memory of a particular moment. The proceeds would go to charity, to AIDS research organizations and cancer charities. The auction raised more than $3 million. But the significance of it went beyond the money. By selling the dresses, Diana was releasing the costumes of her former life. She was saying, quietly and eloquently, that she no longer needed them. That who she was now did not depend on what she had worn to which palace, on which evening in which decade. She was also in this period developing a relationship with Dodi Fayed, the son of Muhammad al-Fayed, the Egyptian businessman who owned Harrods. They had met before, years earlier, through the polo circuit, but their romantic involvement began in the summer of 1997, when Diana accepted an invitation to join the al-Fayed family on their yacht in the south of France. She brought William and Harry. The boys swam in warm Mediterranean water and played on the deck, and were photographed at a distance, looking like boys on a holiday, which is exactly what they were. Diana and Dodi were photographed together. They were seen on the yacht, at dinner, walking through Paris. The press was ecstatic. A new chapter. A new man. A new story. What none of the photographers knew, what none of the editors of those photographs could have imagined as they ran the pictures across their front pages with breathless captions about romance and new beginnings, was how few pages remained. But in the summer of 1997, Diana was alive. Fully, vigorously, beautifully alive. She had come through the longest and most difficult passage of her life. She had endured the collapse of her marriage, the loss of her title, the deliberate severance from the institution that had defined her for 15 years. She had walked through minefields, literally and in every other sense of the word. She had wept in private and spoken with extraordinary honesty in public. She had loved and lost and continued. She had sold her dresses and changed her hair and rebuilt her purpose from the ground up. She had done what almost no one in the history of the monarchy had ever done. She had left and survived the leaving. She had existed outside the institution and discovered that outside was not the void she had been taught to fear, but something far more interesting. She was, in 1997, preparing to travel again. She had been speaking with representatives of the Red Cross. She was planning further trips to landmine-affected regions. She was engaged in conversations about her future philanthropic work, about how to structure it, how to give it weight and permanence. She was, by the accounts of her friends during that summer, happy, not uniformly, not without shadow, but with a quality of hopefulness that those who loved her recognized and were glad to see. She was, as she had always said she wanted to be, a queen in people's hearts. And she was beginning, just beginning, to understand what it might mean to be queen of her own life as well. The summer of 1997 was warm. The light over London was long and golden in the evenings, the kind of light that makes the old city look almost soft. Diana moved through it as she always had, with grace, with the particular quality of attention she gave to every person she met, with that extraordinary capacity to enter a room full of strangers and make each of them feel for a moment entirely seen. She did not know what was coming. None of us did. And so we leave her here, in the warmth of that last summer, in motion, in hope, in the full and complicated and radiant business of becoming whoever she was going to be next. We leave her as she was in her best moments, present, purposeful, and more entirely herself than she had ever been before. The crown she was redefining was not made of gold. It was made of something that cannot be inherited or revoked or regulated by royal charter. It was made of the trust of ordinary people who recognized in her suffering, in her honesty, in her courage, something of their own experience. She had not been born to that crown. She had earned it slowly and painfully, across 15 years of very public becoming. And in the summer of 1997, it sat upon her, quietly and without ceremony, more securely than any other she had ever worn. The Eternal Rose, 1997 and beyond. There are endings that the world absorbs gradually, a slow diminishment, a fading, a quiet closing of a door. And then there are endings that arrive like a fault line splitting open beneath the feet of an entire civilization, sudden and total and irreversible, leaving nothing on either side of the moment quite the same as it was before. The 31st of August 1997 was the second kind. It was a Sunday. In Britain, the last weekend of August carried the particular laziness of late summer. A bank holiday weekend, the kind that empties cities and fills motorways, that sends families to the coast and opens garden gates and slows the news cycle to a murmur. People were still half asleep when the first reports began to come through. A car accident in Paris. A tunnel beneath the Pont de l'Alma. Diana, Princess of Wales. And then, just after 7 o'clock in the morning British time, the news that stopped the world. She was gone. She was 36 years old. Let us go back, just a little. Let us go back to Paris in those final hours, because to understand what followed, the grief, the fury, the transformation, we must first sit with what happened plainly and without flinching. Diana and Dodi Fayed had spent the last days of August in Paris together, having traveled from Sardinia. They stayed at the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme, owned by Dodi's father Mohammed Al Fayed. The city was warm and heavy with late summer heat, and the streets around their hotel were thick with photographers, paparazzi, who had been following Diana with a relentless intensity that had not diminished 1 degree since the divorce. If anything, the combination of Diana and a new romantic companion had sharpened the appetite of the press to something approaching frenzy. On the evening of the 31st, Diana and Dodi dined at the Ritz, and then made the decision to travel to Dodi's apartment. The route was planned. The car changed at the last moment to avoid the photographers gathered at the front of the hotel, a decoy vehicle dispatched to draw attention away. Their driver was Henri Paul, the acting head of security at the Ritz. A bodyguard, Trevor Rhys-Jones, sat in the front passenger seat. The Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at just after midnight. Inside the tunnel, it lost control. The car struck the 13th pillar of the underpass at very high speed. The impact was catastrophic. Dodi Fayed and Henri Paul were killed immediately. Trevor Rhys-Jones survived with serious injuries. Diana was alive when the emergency services reached her, but gravely so. She was taken to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where surgeons fought for hours to save her life. They could not. She was pronounced dead at 4 minutes past 4 in the morning, Paris time. The cause was internal bleeding, a rupture to the pulmonary vein, the kind of injury that gives no outward sign of its devastation until it is already too late. The woman who had walked through minefields in Angola, who had sat beside those dying of AIDS when the rest of the world was afraid to touch them, who had faced down the palace and the press and the weight of an entire institution. That woman died in a hospital in Paris in the very early hours of a Sunday morning, a long way from home. The news traveled at the speed of the age. In 1997, the internet existed but was not yet the nervous system of modern communication that it would become. Word spread through radio, through television, through the telephone. People woke their neighbors. People called their parents. People sat down on the edges of their beds in the dark and found they could not immediately stand back up. Prince Charles was at Balmoral in Scotland with William and Harry. The boys were asleep. Charles was informed first, and he bore the weight of that knowledge alone for a few hours. Alone except for the Queen and the senior members of the royal household who were also staying at the castle. The question of how to tell the boys was among the most agonizing imaginable. William was 15. Harry was 12. They had last seen their mother just days before, at the end of the summer holiday. She had hugged them as she always did, as though she meant it, as though she wanted to hold the feeling of them against her for as long as she could. Charles woke them. He told them himself. By all accounts, he was tender and present in a way that surprised those around him, as though grief had dissolved the formalities between him and his sons, and left only a father and two boys in the wreckage of an August morning. The world, meanwhile, was beginning to understand. In London, people began to gather. Not because anyone had organized it or called for it or issued a directive, but because something instinctive and human draws people together when a loss is too large to absorb alone. They came to Kensington Palace, where Diana had lived. They brought flowers. In the first hours, there were dozens. By the afternoon, there were thousands. By the following morning, there were hundreds of thousands, and the flowers were so deep and so continuous that the pathways leading to the palace gates became rivers of color. Carnations and roses and lilies and simple bunches of supermarket flowers wrapped in cellophane, left by people who had never met her and loved her nonetheless. The smell was extraordinary. Those who were there in those first days have never forgotten it. The dense, sweet, almost overwhelming perfume of an ocean of flowers laid by a city in mourning, warming in the September sun. Notes were tucked among the stems. Thousands of them, handwritten on cards and scraps of paper and pages torn from notebooks. They said things like, "You were the only one who understood." They said, "I never met you, but I felt like you were my friend." They said, "You made me feel less alone." They said, "I love you." They said, "Why?" A simple, terrible, unanswerable word, why. The books of condolence opened at St. James's Palace drew queues that stretched for miles. People waited for hours in the warmth of early September, standing in lines that wound through the streets of London, with a patience and a quiet that seemed entirely at odds with the rawness of what they were feeling. When they reached the front, some signed their names neatly and moved on. Others stood for a long moment, pressing a hand to the page, unable quite to leave. Others wept openly, without embarrassment, because the peculiar permission that mass grief grants is the permission to feel without performance, to be undone in public and find that no one around you thinks less of you for it because they too are undone. Teddy bears appeared among the flowers. Children's drawings. Photographs of Diana cut from magazines and laminated against the damp. A pair of ballet shoes. A handwritten poem in a child's handwriting, the letters careful and slightly uneven. The memorial outside Kensington Palace became something that had no precise precedent in modern British life. A spontaneous, organic collective act of mourning that seemed to contain within it not just grief for Diana specifically, but something broader and deeper, a grief for all the things she had represented. For warmth in cold institutions. For feeling in formal places. For the human heart, inside the machinery of power. And then something shifted. Or rather, something failed to shift when the public expected it to. The royal family remained at Balmoral. The flag above Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast. A matter of protocol, since the flag that flies above the palace traditionally indicates the monarch's presence, and no flag at all would have flown had the Queen been elsewhere. But the public did not see protocol. The public saw a palace with no flag, and a royal family that had retreated to Scotland, and silence from the institution that Diana had served for 15 years, and that many felt had treated her with a cruelty it had never publicly acknowledged. The mood in London shifted from grief to something harder. There was anger beneath the flowers. There was a feeling, raw and genuine and not entirely rational but not entirely wrong either, that the palace did not understand what Diana had meant to the people, and that its silence was a form of contempt. The tabloids, which had spent 15 years documenting Diana's every move, and a significant portion of that time making her life considerably more difficult, now turned on the monarchy with a ferocity that was almost dizzying in its speed. The Daily Mirror asked on its front page to speak for Britain. The Sun published a headline that asked the Queen, "Where are you?" It was, by any measure, an extraordinary moment. The public, the British public, traditionally reserved, famously restrained, culturally allergic to the overt expression of personal emotion, was not behaving as expected. The grief had broken something open. And what poured through the opening was 15 years of feeling for Diana, feeling about the monarchy, feeling about the press, feeling about an entire era that was now suddenly and irrevocably over. Advisors close to the Queen understood the danger. The monarchy, which had survived centuries of revolution and war and social upheaval, was facing something it had no precise protocol for: a crisis of feeling. The people did not want a statement from the Lord Chamberlain's office. They did not want the wheels of constitutional tradition to grind forward as they always had. They wanted the Queen to come to London. They wanted a flag. They wanted to know that the palace felt something. The Queen came to London. On the 5th of September, 4 days after Diana's death, Elizabeth II arrived at Buckingham Palace, and in an act that represented a genuine and significant departure from royal practice, stopped at the gates to look at the flowers and the messages left by the mourners. She paused. She read some of the notes. She spoke to people in the crowd. She had the Union flag flown at half-mast, the first time in recorded history that a flag had flown at half-mast above Buckingham Palace during the monarch's lifetime. That evening, she addressed the nation on live television. She spoke from Buckingham Palace, the London skyline visible through the window behind her, the sounds of the city present if you listened carefully beneath her words. She spoke of Diana as an exceptional and gifted human being. She spoke of her own admiration for Diana, not from the remove of institution but, she said, as a grandmother, as a person who had watched another person struggle and endure and try. It was not a long speech, but its simplicity carried weight, and the phrase that anchored it: "I for one believe that there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death," acknowledged however carefully that something fundamental had changed. The funeral was arranged for the 6th of September, a Saturday. It was, in terms of its logistics alone, one of the most complex events ever organized on British soil. More than 2,000 guests were to be seated inside Westminster Abbey. The route of the funeral cortege through London was planned with the kind of precision that usually attends state occasions. And yet this was not, constitutionally, a state funeral because Diana was no longer a member of the royal family. It was a unique service, created for a unique circumstance, for a woman who had occupied a position no constitutional category had ever adequately described. The morning of the 6th of September 1997 arrived cool and pale. London was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. The millions who had come to the city in the days since Diana's death were now lining the streets of the funeral route, standing 6, 8, 10 deep along the pavements of the Mall and Whitehall and the roads that led to Westminster Abbey. They had stood there for hours, some of them since the night before, wrapped in coats and sharing food and talking in low voices the way people do when they are keeping vigil together. The gun carriage carrying Diana's coffin left Kensington Palace at 9:45 in the morning. It was draped with the royal standard, and on top of the coffin lay 3 wreaths of white flowers. One was from the Spencer family. One was from Prince Charles. One was from William and Harry, and tucked into it was an envelope with a single word written on it in a child's handwriting. The word was mummy. There are moments of such concentrated grief that language begins to fail them, when the attempt to describe begins to feel like a trespass on something that should simply be felt. This was one of those moments. The sight of that envelope, of that single word written by a 12-year-old boy for a mother who would never read it, passed through the consciousness of everyone who saw it and left something changed. The procession moved through the streets of London for an hour and 20 minutes. Walking behind the coffin were Prince Philip, Prince Charles, William and Harry, and Diana's brother Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer. To see 2 teenage boys walking behind their mother's coffin through the streets of a capital city, watched by a million silent people, it was almost more than the human heart could hold. Flowers were thrown onto the root of the coffin. The crowds, mostly silent, occasionally broke into the sound of applause, that unusual British instinct to honor by clapping, uncertain what else the body knows to do when gratitude and grief arrive together. Westminster Abbey holds 2,000 people. Outside its walls, enormous screens had been erected in the parks of London, in Hyde Park and Green Park and Regent's Park, so that those who could not be inside could still be present. It was estimated that 3.5 billion people watched Diana's funeral on television worldwide. 3.5 billion. At that time, it was the largest television audience in human history. The service was extraordinary. The music was extraordinary. Elton John sat at the piano inside Westminster Abbey and performed a version of his song "Candle in the Wind," its lyrics rewritten for Diana, the phrase "Goodbye England's Rose" replacing the original opening, and the sound of it in that space, in that moment with the coffin present and the congregation barely breathing, was unlike anything that had been heard in that building before. Some wept openly. Some sat entirely still. Some found that what they felt exceeded the ordinary categories of feeling, and could not be named at all. And then came Charles Spencer. Diana's brother rose to deliver the eulogy, and what he delivered was not the careful, measured tribute of a man mindful of his surroundings and his audience. It was something else entirely. It was a statement. He spoke of Diana's kindness and her naturalness, and her humor and her intuition. He spoke of the way she related to people, not across the distance of hierarchy, but at the level of the heart. He spoke of the press, of the hunting pack as he called it, and of the role he believed it had played in her suffering. He spoke of his nephews and made in front of the world a pledge to Diana that the Spencer family would play its part in ensuring that William and Harry's souls would not simply be molded into duty and tradition, but would retain the imaginative and feeling life that their mother had worked so hard to give them. And then he said, she needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic. The applause began outside. In Hyde Park, in Green Park, in the streets, among the millions who were watching and listening, a wave of clapping began that traveled through the open doors of Westminster Abbey and entered the building itself, so that the congregation inside, hearing it arrive from the world outside, began to applaud as well, until the sound filled one of the most formal buildings in England with something it had rarely if ever contained, the sound of an enormous crowd saying yes. The coffin was driven north after the service. Past the streets of London, still lined with mourners who threw flowers onto the road as it passed, so many flowers that the wheels of the hearse made a soft sound moving through them. Along the motorway, where ordinary people stood on bridges and overpasses, and held up signs and scattered petals onto the road from above. Through Northamptonshire to the Spencer family estate at Althorpe, where Diana was to be buried. She was buried on a small island in an ornamental lake called the Round Oval, within the grounds of Althorpe. The island can be seen but not easily reached. It exists at a slight remove from the world, surrounded by water, quiet. It was in its way a perfect choice. She had spent so much of her life in the full and relentless view of others. She was given in death a measure of the privacy she had rarely known. The gates of Althorpe were covered in the days and weeks that followed, with more flowers, more notes, more messages from people who had traveled from across the country and across the world simply to be near the place where she was. And then the world, which had stopped, began again. The aftermath of Diana's death unfolded across the months and years that followed in ways that were far-reaching and in some cases deeply surprising. The monarchy, which had emerged from those first days after her death shaken and somewhat diminished, began slowly and cautiously to change. Not all at once. Not with any dramatic announcement of reform. But the lesson that the Queen herself had identified, that there were things to be learned from Diana's life and from the public's response to it, was not entirely lost. The years that followed saw the palace become incrementally more open, more willing to acknowledge the emotional lives of its members, more attentive to the relationship between the institution and the public that sustained it. Charles Spencer's pledge about William and Harry was, in its way, honored, not by the Spencers alone, but by circumstance and by the boys themselves, who grew into men shaped visibly by their mother's influence, by her warmth and her commitment and her belief in the value of presence, of actually being with people, of sitting beside someone in pain and not looking away. Prince William, in particular, carried Diana's legacy with a consciousness that became increasingly visible as he moved toward adulthood. His own charitable work, the causes he championed, his insistence on a degree of emotional openness that was genuinely unusual for senior royals, all of it bore the unmistakable mark of his mother. When he married Catherine Middleton in 2011, he wore his mother's engagement ring on Catherine's hand, a gesture so simple and so loaded with feeling that it required no explanation to anyone watching. Harry, the younger son, the one who had been 12 years old on that August morning, and had walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London before he was quite old enough to fully comprehend what he was doing, Harry carried Diana's legacy differently and more painfully. He spoke publicly years later, of the grief that had never been properly processed, of the damage done by requiring a child to perform composure at a public funeral while the world watched. He spoke of the silence around her death within the family, of the absence of permission to mourn openly or at length. His path was more turbulent, more searching, and in many ways more honest, in the way that Diana herself had been honest, about the cost of growing up inside an institution that places duty above feeling. The landmine campaign to which Diana had given her energy and her image in those final years did not end with her death. In December of 1997, less than 4 months after the accident in Paris, the Ottawa Treaty, the international convention banning anti-personnel landmines, was signed by 122 countries. Diana had not lived to see it, but those who had worked on the campaign in those final months were clear. Her involvement had changed the conversation. She had taken a technical policy argument and given it a face, a feeling, a human dimension that no amount of diplomatic correspondence could replicate. The treaty that came into force in 1999 had many authors. She was among them. The fashion world paused, and then reorganized itself around her memory. The dress she had worn on the evening of Charles's Dimbleby interview, the now famous revenge dress, the black Christina Stambolian gown she had worn to a Serpentine Gallery party, with the strategic brilliance of someone who understood image as a language, entered fashion history as one of the most significant moments of dress as statement in the 20th century. Her archive of clothes, her aesthetic evolution, the way she had used style as a form of communication and eventually of liberation, all of it continued to be studied, referenced, and celebrated by designers and cultural historians in the years and decades that followed. Charitable foundations continued in her name. The Diana Award, established in her memory, recognizes young people for humanitarian work, a continuation in some sense of what she had always believed, that compassion is not the exclusive property of the powerful, that the impulse to help, to show up, to sit beside someone in their worst moment exists in the young as much as in the experienced and deserves to be recognized and encouraged. And then there is the harder legacy. The questions that did not go away. The circumstances of the accident in Paris were the subject of official investigations by both French and British authorities. The French inquiry found that the crash was caused primarily by the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul, who had alcohol and prescription medication in his system. The British inquiry, completed in 2004, reached similar conclusions. But the questions persisted in the public imagination, fueled by conspiracy theories, by the sense among some of Diana's admirers that the official accounts were insufficient, that the story was too large and too painful to have so ordinary and accidental an explanation. Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, pursued his own legal challenge for years, convinced that the deaths were not accidental but deliberate. In 2008, a British inquest jury returned a verdict of unlawful killing by the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the pursuing vehicles of the paparazzi. The role of the press, the relentless, suffocating, ultimately fatal proximity of the photographers who had followed Diana for 15 years, was not, even in the official findings, an entirely comfortable thing to set aside. Because the press that mourned her most extravagantly had also hunted her most persistently. The newspapers that ran acres of tribute in the days after her death were the same newspapers that had run the photographs, that had created the market that sent photographers to Paris that August night, that had made her image worth so much money that men would chase her through a tunnel in the dark. The grief was genuine. The complicity was also genuine. And in Britain, in the years after Diana's death, the relationship between the press and public figures, between the press and royalty in particular, began slowly and unevenly to be renegotiated. The phone hacking scandals of subsequent years, the Leveson inquiry, the eventual closure of the News of the World, all of it unfolded in a media culture that had been altered by Diana's life and by the manner of her death, by the question that hung in the air over everything: how much is too much? When does the public's right to know become something else entirely? There are no clean answers. There never are, in the places where public life and private feeling intersect. Diana knew this better than almost anyone. She had lived at that intersection for 15 years. What endures 30 years on and counting is not any single fact about her life. It is not the marriages or the divorces or the interviews or the dresses. What endures is the feeling she generated, the extraordinary, almost inexplicable sense that she was accessible, that she saw people, that when she looked at someone, really looked at them, she was not calculating the political optics of the encounter or noting how it would play in the morning papers. She was simply present. Fully, warmly, dangerously present. In an era of managed images and institutional messaging, of public figures trained to reveal exactly as much as their advisors deemed strategically appropriate, Diana's transparency was revolutionary. She cried in public. She admitted failure. She described her own suffering in terms that were precise and recognizable to anyone who had ever felt alone inside a situation that looked fine from the outside. She made the people watching feel that it was acceptable to feel, that feeling was not weakness, that the admission of pain was not an act of indignity but of courage. This is what she gave. Not just the charity work, not just the fashion, not just the extraordinary photogenic quality that made every camera love her, but the permission to be human. The demonstration, conducted over 15 years in the most visible place imaginable, that vulnerability and strength are not opposites, but the same thing wearing different faces. She was not perfect. She was not saintly. She was capable of manipulation, and of stubbornness, and of the particular kind of vindictiveness that comes from spending years feeling cornered. She was contradictory and difficult, and sometimes impossible, and she would have been the first to admit it, because honesty about imperfection was one of the few things she had always given freely. But she was real. In a world of performance, she was real. In a system designed to produce symbols, she remained a person. And in the end it was the person, not the princess, not the royal, not the icon, that the world loved. The roses at Kensington Palace had all died by October. The cellophane wrappers had been gathered, and the notes had been carefully archived. The pathways that had run deep with color returned to their ordinary stone. London resumed its ordinary pace, its gray and particular beauty, its forward motion. But something had changed. Something in the relationship between the people and the institution they had been raised to venerate, something in the understanding of what public service might mean, something in the permission granted to those who followed, to feel, to speak, to be more than the role, had shifted permanently. She had done that. Simply by being herself, as fully as she could manage, in the most watched life of her generation, she had moved something. The lake at Althorpe is quiet in all seasons. In spring, the trees around it come into leaf in the slow and particular way of English trees, unhurried and green. In summer, the water holds the light. In autumn, the leaves go gold and fall and settle on the surface. In winter, the island is white and still and perfectly itself. She is there. The eternal rose, as her brother called her. Gone from the world that needed her, present in the memory of everyone who ever felt, even for a moment, that she saw them. And she did. That is the thing that cannot be taken away, cannot be revised or repackaged or reconsidered into irrelevance. She looked at the world. She looked at its suffering and its loneliness and its need. She looked at the people the cameras did not usually find, the sick, the bereaved, the forgotten, the afraid, and she looked at them with her full attention, with everything she had, without flinching and without calculation. And they felt it. They felt seen. In the end, that is the whole of it. That is the legacy that no title can confer, and no palace can revoke. She saw people. And the people, in return, never stopped seeing her. You have been listening to Princess Diana, the iconography of modern royalty. What endures is not any single fact about her life, the marriages, the divorces, the interviews, or the dresses. What endures is the feeling she generated, the permission she granted to be human, and the demonstration that vulnerability and strength are not opposites, but the same thing wearing different faces. That is the legacy that no title can confer, and no palace can revoke. Thank you for listening to this production.